From Earth, Jupiter appears almost perfect, radiant, distant, and mesmerizing. But the more carefully I think about it, the more I realize that the most frightening part is not setting foot there, nor even surviving in its vicinity. What truly gives one pause is the prospect of coming back. We have sent spacecraft to Jupiter more than once. Galileo orbited that giant gas planet for many years. Juno is still there, continuing to send back data and spectacular images. But there is one chilling detail. Not a single one has ever returned. Not because people forgot to calculate a way home, but because from the very beginning, the return trip was almost excluded from the equation. NASA's familiar way of ending these missions is to send the spacecraft plunging into Jupiter's atmosphere, where the mission ends. Not for lack of imagination, but because physics does not compromise. Every obstacle here compounds the others. Fuel, radiation, flight time, each one alone is harsh enough, but together they turn a return mission into something almost suffocatingly difficult. Just to leave Jupiter's doorstep and begin heading home, a spacecraft would need nearly as much energy as it once took to leave Earth's surface and reach orbit. That number reveals the cruelty of it all. After nearly 500 million miles of travel, after years crossing deep space, after surviving long enough to reach the destination, you still have to spend an enormous burst of energy just to begin turning back. In the language of mission designers, that cost is measured in delta V, the total change in velocity a spacecraft must achieve. From low Earth orbit, reaching Jupiter requires about 9 kilometers per second, and escaping Jupiter's gravitational influence to start the journey back demands another very large amount of delta V. Add up all the orbital maneuvers, course corrections, and velocity changes, and the budget for a round trip can exceed 40 kilometers per second, and changing velocity is never free. It requires fuel, and here, the rocket equation begins to reveal its true severity. Every kilogram of fuel reserved for the return journey has to be carried all the way from Earth. To carry that fuel, you need even more fuel. Then to carry that extra fuel, you need more still. The mass grows exponentially like compound interest, except instead of making you rich, it swells the spacecraft to the point of impossibility. Today's chemical rockets simply cannot carry that kind of burden. The fuel tanks alone would already have to be larger than anything humanity has ever launched. To carry enough fuel for a return from Jupiter, the spacecraft might need to be the size of a small building, and that is before accounting for scientific instruments, living quarters for a crew, or life support systems. That is why, up to now, every mission to Jupiter has effectively been a one-way trip. With conventional propulsion, the math simply does not close. Of course, engineers have not ignored more elegant alternatives. Gravity assists are one of them. Juno used exactly this trick to reach Jupiter. It skimmed past Earth, borrowed some of our planet's momentum as it swung around, and gained an extra 7 kilometers per second of speed without burning a single drop of fuel. In theory, a return journey could do something similar, using Jupiter's moons or planets encountered along the way to gain the extra push it needs. But that cleverness comes with its own price. Every gravity assist has to happen at almost exactly the right moment. The planets must be in precisely the right positions. Miss the window by just a few days, and the spacecraft may have to wait months, even years, for the next opportunity. String several of these assists together into one mission, and the flight path instantly becomes a maze of orbital mechanics. And every detour, no matter how ingenious, only makes an already long mission even longer. Juno took 5 years to reach Jupiter, and that was only one way, without the added mass required for a return trip. For a round-trip journey, the minimum time scale to consider is a decade, perhaps far longer, depending on the trajectory and how heavily it relies on gravity assists. And a decade in space, I think, could never be understood in quite the same way as a decade on Earth. There is one point, when I think about a mission to Jupiter, where all the romance of space exploration almost disappears. To survive a mission lasting something like 10 years, everything aboard would have to function almost perfectly from beginning to end. The life support system could not afford a single failure. The electronics would not only have to endure the journey, but also withstand the very place they were going to. And that place, if you look closely enough, is anything but gentle. From Earth, Jupiter looks beautiful in an almost surreal way. But as you draw nearer, you enter an environment that is trying to kill you. Its magnetic field is about 20,000 times stronger than Earth's, and it completes a full rotation every 10 hours. That immense magnetic engine sweeps charged particles along with it, accelerates them to astonishing energies, and creates radiation belts that make Earth's Van Allen belts look as harmless as a soft patch of sunlight. This is not the kind of radiation people usually imagine from an X-ray or from the images associated with Chernobyl. Around Jupiter, it is a continuous bombardment of high-energy particles passing through everything in their path. It is even hard to describe it as radiation that comes from somewhere, because here it is almost the environment itself. It fills Jupiter's magnetosphere, a region of space averaging about 20 million kilometers across, roughly 150 times the width of the planet itself. Juno was built to face that hell. The spacecraft was designed to withstand up to 20 million rad over the course of its mission. Engineers had to build a dedicated titanium vault, with walls about 1 centimeter thick and weighing 180 kilograms, just to protect the most sensitive electronics. But even with that level of shielding, by Juno's 56th orbit, its camera was already showing signs of serious radiation damage, corrupted images, a destroyed voltage regulator. If a machine reinforced that heavily still degrades, then the human body with flesh, blood, and DNA has almost no natural chance of adapting. At Io, the large moon closest to Jupiter, an unshielded person would absorb about 36 sieverts per day. At Europa, a little farther out, the number is still above 5 sieverts per day. Less than 1 sievert over a few days is enough to cause radiation sickness. At 4 to 5 sieverts, the likelihood of death becomes very high. In other words, the daily exposure levels in those regions are enough to kill a human being within days, perhaps even hours. Shielding clearly helps, but it does not solve the problem completely. To block radiation, you need more material, and more material means more mass. For a crewed mission, not only the electronics would need protection, but the human body would also have to be shielded for months or years. That protective mass alone could consume a significant fraction of the spacecraft's total mass, pressing even harder on a propulsion problem that is already nearly impossible. And even if you could build shielding thick enough, long-term exposure at lower levels would still open the door to a whole range of uncertain consequences. Increased cancer risk, cataracts, damage to the central nervous system, cardiovascular disease. The biological effects of spending years near Jupiter remain a blind spot, because no human has ever gone that far beyond Earth's protective magnetic bubble. In a sense, the crew would become living test subjects in an experiment with no control group and no way to stop early if things began to go wrong. Then there is communication. At Jupiter's distance, a radio signal takes about 45 minutes to travel one way to Earth. A full exchange takes around 90 minutes. If an emergency happens, the crew would be left alone for at least an hour and a half before mission control even knew what was happening, let alone offered advice. Real-time control from Earth simply does not exist out there. Every decision would have to be made by the spacecraft itself or by the people on board. That is entirely different from the International Space Station, where astronauts can be guided from the ground almost immediately. Different even from lunar missions, where the delay is only a few seconds. Mars rovers can wait for instructions because they are machines. But on a crewed mission to Jupiter, medical emergencies, system failures, navigation choices, all of it would have to be handled in isolation. And that isolation is not only technical, it is a psychological pressure that is almost impossible to fully express. You are farther from home than any human being has ever been. Earth has shrunk to a tiny dot lost among the stars. Your family's voice takes 90 minutes for a round trip. If something catastrophic happens, no one is coming to rescue you. There is no emergency team beyond the horizon. Either you solve the problem yourself, or you die in the most remote and hostile environment humanity has ever tried to reach. Even the power supply refuses to let this problem go. At Jupiter's distance, solar panels receive only about 4% of the energy they would get in Earth orbit. To generate enough power for life support, system operations, and propulsion, the solar arrays would have to expand to an unwieldy size difficult to manage and vulnerable to micrometeoroids and radiation. The other option is nuclear power. Radioisotope thermoelectric generators have served deep space exploration for decades, but their output is limited and depends on plutonium-238, which is both expensive and scarce. A crewed mission would need far more power than that, which means that, realistically, you are almost forced to think in terms of a true nuclear reactor, bringing with it more mass, more complexity, and yet another layer of safety risk on top of an already suffocating set of problems. But even in the boldest assumption that a new propulsion system has solved the fuel problem, that shielding is good enough, that the crew has been prepared both technically and psychologically, that the power system is robust enough, there is still one final gate to pass through. Returning from Jupiter does not simply mean coming home. It also means plunging into Earth's atmosphere at a speed high enough to make even the Apollo astronauts uneasy. Even if humanity managed the seemingly impossible task of turning back from Jupiter and returning, the most dangerous part would not necessarily be behind them. The velocity of such a return trajectory could send the spacecraft into Earth's atmosphere at more than 14 kilometers per second faster than any crewed spacecraft has ever re-entered. At that speed, the plasma forming around the vehicle would become hotter than anything the Apollo-era heat shields were ever designed to endure. In theory, Earth's atmosphere could be used to slow the spacecraft without burning fuel through an aerobraking or aerocapture maneuver. But the price would be plunging into that atmosphere at an almost insane speed and placing the entire crew's survival in the hands of a single entry angle and a heat shield. Deviate by even a tiny fraction of a degree, and the spacecraft would either skip back into space or burn up. There is no meaningful margin for error to cling to. What makes that prospect even more frightening is the condition the spacecraft would be in by then. It would have spent a decade in deep space, been eroded by radiation, endured extreme thermal cycling, and likely degraded after years of exposure to the harshest environment human engineering has ever tried to endure. And then, after all that, it would still be asked to survive the most violent re-entry ever attempted. That is why no spacecraft has ever returned from Jupiter. Not because we are completely incapable of building a machine that can get there. The problem is building a system that can survive the journey, perform useful work at the destination, and then come home intact, and it is that combination of demands that pushes everything to the very edge of what current engineering and physics can support. Here, no difficulty exists in isolation. Add more fuel, and the spacecraft becomes heavier. More mass requires more shielding. More shielding adds still more weight, and the cycle loops back into demanding even more fuel. A longer mission makes system reliability a matter of survival. Yet the radiation environment itself causes systems to degrade faster than in any place our machines have ever reached. The distance makes communication slow and difficult, while the mission itself is so complex that it almost seems to require continuous coordination. And that is still only the beginning of the story. For humans, there are also the physiological changes that come after years in microgravity. There is the life support system, which must recycle every molecule of air and water without failing even once. There is food for a journey lasting years. There are medical needs for emergencies that are almost certain to arise during such a long trip. So the real question is no longer whether returning from Jupiter is hard. The question is whether, with technology close to what we have now, it is feasible at all. And if the answer is yes, then whether any crew would willingly trade 10 years of their lives to step into risks that we ourselves still cannot fully measure. If we try to imagine the spacecraft for such a mission, the first thing to abandon is the idea that we could simply scale up a Mars-bound design and be done with it. No, the engineering requirements here are so different that almost everything would have to begin again from scratch. That spacecraft would have to protect human beings for 10 years, It would need enough thrust to reach Jupiter within an acceptable time frame, carry enough fuel to enter orbit around the planet, sustain operations there, then escape again for the return to Earth. It would need to shield the crew from radiation intense enough to kill them within days, generate power at a distance 5 times farther from the Sun than Earth, keep the life support system running flawlessly for a full decade, and in the end, still survive a re-entry more violent than anything humanity has ever tested. Just thinking about the mass alone is overwhelming. Current estimates suggest that a crewed mission to Mars might already require between 800 and 1,200 tons delivered to low Earth orbit, and that is for a journey vastly shorter to a destination vastly closer. For Jupiter, that scale might have to increase many times over. We are talking about a structure that could far exceed even the International Space Station, which itself took more than a decade and dozens of launches to assemble in orbit. And it is here that the picture begins to shift. Perhaps that spacecraft would not be built on Earth at all. The rocket equation makes launching such an enormous mass from a planetary surface with chemical rockets almost intolerable. A more realistic approach would be to assemble it in space at a gateway station near the Moon, or perhaps even on the Moon itself. Resources there could become part of the solution. Lunar material for radiation shielding, polar water ice split into hydrogen and oxygen for fuel, and lower gravity, making it far easier to lift components into space than launching them from Earth. What is remarkable is that this idea no longer belongs entirely to science fiction. The infrastructure needed to make that kind of construction possible is already part of the direction NASA's Artemis program is pursuing. If humanity ever truly prepares for a journey to Jupiter, the spacecraft will most likely not begin on Earth. A more plausible image, I think, is a chain of infrastructure quietly taking shape around the Moon. Gateway as a staging point, mining operations on the lunar surface supplying raw materials, and manufacturing facilities in low-gravity assembling components that would be almost impossible to build on Earth. By that logic, a ship bound for Jupiter would be something born in space, not launched whole from the ground. But even if the construction yard has been moved into orbit, the most merciless problem still remains: propulsion. Chemical rockets are simply not efficient enough for a round trip to Jupiter. Their specific impulse, the measure of how economically they use fuel, is not high enough to save the equation. To go there and back, the amount of propellant required would swell to the point that the spacecraft itself would become hopelessly enormous. That is why almost every serious concept for a crewed mission to Jupiter has to step beyond the world of purely chemical engines and turn instead toward nuclear propulsion or some form of advanced electric propulsion. Among these, nuclear thermal rockets are an especially striking option. The idea is to use a nuclear reactor to heat hydrogen to extremely high temperatures, then expel that gas out the back at tremendous speed. The resulting efficiency could be roughly twice that of chemical rockets. At first glance, that may sound like only a modest improvement, but under the rule of the rocket equation, that difference actually opens up a leap in performance far greater than it first appears. What matters is that this is not some untouched fantasy. NASA's NERVA program, tested as far back as the 1960s, already showed that the principle is entirely feasible. The foundational technology is no longer imaginary. What still hangs in the balance is whether we can scale it up enough for a crewed mission to Jupiter, and whether we can do so while overcoming the safety and political concerns tied to launching a nuclear reactor into space. At the other end of the technological spectrum are electric engines, such as ion thrusters. They are even more efficient, but they almost trade efficiency for patience. Their thrust is only fractions of a Newton. They can work tirelessly for years, gradually building up velocity, but they are poorly suited for moments when a spacecraft must change course quickly and forcefully. So the most reasonable approach may lie not in a single technology, but in a combination. Electric propulsion handling the long, slow stretches of the journey, while nuclear, thermal, or chemical engines take over during critical phases such as orbital insertion or major trajectory changes. And then, even if propulsion is no longer the main barrier, Another question appears immediately: what the place where humans will live inside such a machine must actually look like. It would certainly have to be far larger than any habitat we have ever sent into space. On missions lasting many years, confinement is no longer just an inconvenience. It becomes a psychological threat. What we have learned from Antarctic research stations and submarine crews suggests that human beings need a minimum volume around them to maintain mental stability. For a journey lasting an entire decade, that requirement might be on the order of 50 to 100 cubic meters per person, and that still does not include communal areas, workspaces, or the life support systems themselves. But the living space on a Jupiter-bound spacecraft cannot simply be spacious. It must also be heavy. Radiation means the crew habitat has to be shielded by a very large amount of material, and water emerges as an especially practical solution. Some designs therefore propose surrounding the crew compartment with water tanks, using them both as radiation shielding and as water storage for the mission. Even so, the elegance of the idea does not change the essence of the problem. You still have to bring tons of protective material into space and integrate all of it into the spacecraft's structure. Then there is artificial gravity, perhaps the hardest issue to ignore if humans are truly going to live out there for 10 years. Prolonged exposure to microgravity would degrade the body to such an extent that by the time the crew reached Jupiter, they might no longer be capable of functioning normally, let alone returning to Earth. Bones would become more brittle, muscles would waste away, and the cardiovascular system would gradually lose its ability to adapt. Even on the ISS, with the most intense exercise regimen we have ever maintained, astronauts still lose around 1 to 2% of bone density per month in critical regions such as the hips and spine. Extend that over years, and the physical cost becomes almost unacceptable. That is why the only real solution usually discussed here is artificial gravity through rotation. Spin the spacecraft to generate centrifugal force, and use that force as an approximate substitute for gravity. But as soon as that solution appears, a new layer of engineering challenges appears with it. The spacecraft has to be large enough that the rotation rate does not create Coriolis effects severe enough to leave the crew constantly nauseated. At the same time, the structure must also separate a rotating section from a non-rotating one, because some equipment can only operate reliably in a part of the craft that is not spinning. There again, the answer does not lie in a single breakthrough, but in accepting that a Jupiter-bound spacecraft would have to be an entirely different mechanical ecosystem from anything humanity has ever called a spacecraft. There is one thing that is easy to overlook when people talk about artificial gravity as an elegant solution. For a spacecraft to keep spinning for 10 years, those bearings and rotational mechanisms would have to remain reliable almost without fail. A continuously moving system like that, by itself, is already a challenge. Some designs choose a dumbbell configuration, 2 habitation modules connected by cables or a rigid truss, rotating around their shared center of mass to maximize radius with the mass available. Other concepts lean toward rotating rings or cylinders. None of these options is perfect. Each one is a trade-off among complexity, reliability, and structural burden. But even rotation is not the most unforgiving part. That distinction belongs to life support. On the ISS, humanity has learned to recycle about 90% of its water use, an impressive achievement. But on a 10-year journey, the remaining losses, that mere 10%, would still accumulate into a mass too large to justify carrying from the start. For Jupiter, very good is no longer good enough. Nearly every molecule of water, every breath of oxygen, would have to be recovered and cycled back with efficiency approaching 100%. Existing systems have already shown the foundation of this challenge. Water is purified through filtration, distillation, and chemical processes. Oxygen is split from water by electrolysis. Carbon dioxide is removed from the air, and its carbon can be combined with hydrogen to produce water and methane. On the ISS, that methane is currently vented, but on a mission to Jupiter, there is no room for that kind of waste. Either it has to be stored, or it has to be processed further to recover the hydrogen. Everything becomes a closed loop to an almost absolute degree. The problem is that such closed-loop systems are anything but simple. They wear down, they need maintenance, they need filters replaced, they need new components, and when you are 2 years of flight time away from Earth, there is no calling for spare parts. The spacecraft would have to carry backups for every component that might fail, while also having the ability to manufacture at least some replacement parts during the mission through 3D printing or other production techniques. In other words, it would not merely be a habitat, it would have to be a technical ecosystem capable of repairing itself. Then comes food. A crew of 6, each consuming about 2,500 calories a day for 10 years, would need roughly 20 tons of food. Some of that mass might be reduced by growing food on board, but the trade-off would be more space, more water, more nutrients, and more electrical power for lighting. So some concepts move toward a hybrid model, carrying enough long-life stored food for the full journey, while supplementing it with fresh nutrition from compact hydroponic systems growing leafy greens and herbs. There are no easy options here, only different versions of compromise. But then I think perhaps the most fragile part is still not the machinery or the supplies, but the people. Who would you send on a flight like that? It would require not only healthy bodies, but minds resilient in ways we have scarcely ever had a chance to test. Submarine crews usually serve for only a few months. Antarctic research teams generally last about a year, and even then there is still some possibility of evacuation if things go badly. But with Jupiter, once the crew departs, they are essentially handing over 10 years of their lives to the mission, with no door back in the middle of the journey. That is why the selection criteria would have to be entirely different. Technical skill would still matter, of course, but it would never be enough on its own. You would need people who can remain psychologically stable through prolonged isolation, who can handle conflict constructively when there is nowhere to escape from one another, and who can keep motivation from collapsing as the mission stretches on year after year. Some psychologists even argue that the group's collective motivation matters more than the endurance of any single individual. The wrong mix of personalities could destroy the entire mission, even if each person alone were exceptional. On the other hand, a crew that genuinely fits together might survive things that would crush a team full of brilliant people who simply cannot live together. Then there is medicine, another chapter that feels almost entirely made of nightmare scenarios. If someone suffers a medical emergency after 3 years of flight, there will be no rescue helicopter, no hospital, no emergency transfer. At least one person on board would need serious medical capability, perhaps even enough to perform surgery. The spacecraft would need a medical bay capable of handling everything from appendicitis and fractures to dental emergencies. In effect, the ship would have to carry a miniature hospital, complete with diagnostic equipment, surgical instruments, medications, and perhaps even the ability to produce drugs that might degrade after years in space. Some medical situations are enough, even in imagination, to reveal how fragile the entire mission would be. A severe injury or serious illness could force the whole expedition to abort if the trajectory still allowed that. And if a crew member died during the journey, the psychological effect on those who remained might be not only devastating, but a direct threat to the survival of the whole group. And even after all those layers of risk, when the spacecraft finally reaches Jupiter, the real work would only just be beginning. A journey that has consumed 5 years cannot end with a few photographs. The crew would have to study the planet's atmosphere, its magnetic field, and the radiation belts that nearly destroyed electronics during approach. They would have to go to Europa, where an underground ocean lies hidden beneath the ice. They would have to visit Ganymede, with its own magnetic field. They would have to approach Io, a literal volcanic hell. But every destination would be a different orbital problem, and every orbit would bring a different level of radiation exposure. Europa is especially compelling scientifically, and especially dangerous. This moon lies deep within Jupiter's radiation belts, and receives about 5.4 sieverts per day. Without shielding, just a few hours could be enough for radiation sickness to begin. And so the old problem returns again. like a kind of technical fate that refuses to release the spacecraft at any stage of the journey. If you want to survive, you need more shielding. More shielding increases mass. More mass demands more fuel. And more fuel in turn adds more mass. Once again, the rocket equation follows the entire mission like its shadow. There is a cold paradox at Jupiter. The longer you stay, the more valuable the mission becomes, and the more dangerous it becomes as well. More time means more time for radiation to accumulate its effects. More time also means every system aboard has more opportunities to degrade, to malfunction, to fail in ways no one can predict. Consumable supplies quietly thin out day by day. And yet, after spending so many years just to get there, no one could accept merely skimming past and leaving. This is the kind of mission that may come only once in a lifetime, perhaps once in a century. Its scientific return would have to be great enough to justify the immense price paid for it. And precisely because the crew would have to remain long enough for the mission to be worthwhile, the moment of leaving Jupiter becomes especially brutal. The way home is not simply the outbound route run in reverse. When departing from Earth, a spacecraft can afford to patiently build up speed through gravity assists from Venus, then Earth again, perhaps even Mars. But when leaving Jupiter, everything is different. By then, the spacecraft is already deep inside the gravity well of that giant planet. To return home, it first has to become fast enough to pull itself back out of that well. The number required is enough to make anyone pause, about 9 kilometers per second, just to escape Jupiter's direct gravitational influence. Nearly the same order of speed needed to reach orbit from Earth's surface, which means that, in a sense, you are being asked to launch all over again. Except this time, the launch pad is a spacecraft that has been drifting through space for 5 years. And the question immediately turns cruel. Where does that velocity come from? There are options. None of them are comfortable. The most blunt solution is to carry enough fuel to burn your way out directly. But that is also where the math begins to strangle itself. Most of the propellant has already been spent getting to Jupiter and maneuvering around it. Any fuel reserved for the return leg, if it exists at all, had to be carried from Earth from the very beginning. And to carry more fuel, you need still more fuel to carry that extra amount. That familiar spiral quickly slips into the realm of impossibility. The more elegant escape is to rely on gravity assists. Jupiter's moons can be used like orbital slingshots, allowing the spacecraft to steal a portion of momentum as it flies past them. Ganymede, with its size and mass, is large enough to provide a meaningful push. But what sounds graceful depends on almost absolute precision. Miss the timing window, and the spacecraft may have to wait months for the next chance. And every such maneuver takes place through radiation zones where even small errors can bring major consequences. There are even bolder possibilities, using Jupiter itself to accelerate on the way out, diving closer to the planet to gather additional speed before turning back toward the Sunday. But the price is passing through radiation even fiercer than the regions around the moons. You would have to do it fast, and almost simply hope the electronics could endure. There is another worry too, quieter but no less frightening, whether the engines themselves would still work when the time came. Any propulsion system that managed to carry the spacecraft all the way to Jupiter would already have spent 5 years living through vacuum, radiation, and extreme thermal cycling. The propellant would have remained in a cryogenic state for half a decade, would some of it have boiled away. Would the tanks still retain their integrity? No one could know for certain until the moment of ignition, and by then, there would be no chance to repair anything. The burn to leave Jupiter would not be a brief burst like launching a satellite. It could last for hours. Hours of continuous thrust. Hours in which the guidance system would have to calculate and correct the trajectory in real time. A single failure during that phase could leave the spacecraft stranded in a half-escaped elliptical orbit, not fast enough to break free, yet sufficient to send it falling back toward Jupiter. And if that happened, all hope would depend on a very small and very merciless question. Would there be enough fuel left to try again? Even if the burn succeeded, the spacecraft still would not truly be free of Jupiter's shadow. Jupiter's magnetosphere stretches across millions of kilometers, which means that for days, perhaps weeks afterward, the ship would still be bathing in radiation as it slowly climbed out of the planet's gravitational well. During that phase, every decision about the spacecraft's orientation becomes a problem of balance. The solar arrays must face the sun to maintain power. The best shielded side should face Jupiter to cut down the radiation exposure. The antenna needs to point toward Earth. The radiators must face cold space. All of these demands happen at once, and there is almost no room for error. Communication, at that point, becomes something both essential and useless in the bitterest possible way. A radio signal from Jupiter's distance takes about 43 minutes to reach Earth one way. A full exchange takes nearly an hour and a half. If something goes wrong during the escape burn, the crew would be entirely alone. Mission Control could not intervene in time. By the time Earth knew there was a problem, the moment when useful advice might still matter would almost certainly have passed. And then, when the ship finally does escape Jupiter for real, another fact becomes clear, one that few people really notice. The return trip is almost as long as the journey out. It is the same distance, only in reverse. It is still about another 5 years in space. This time, instead of falling inward through the solar system, the spacecraft has to work its way back against the orbital energy arrangement that once carried it outward. 5 more years of microgravity continuing to gnaw away at bone and muscle. 5 more years of radiation not as fierce as near Jupiter, perhaps, but never truly absent. Cosmic rays, solar radiation, all of it remains there, persistent as the background fabric of the universe. 5 more years of isolation, while Earth grows only very slowly in the window, and each passing day arrives with the thought that if something breaks now, no rescue mission could ever arrive in time. Meanwhile, the spacecraft itself continues to age. The systems that endured the outbound journey and the operational phase around Jupiter must now survive another 5 years. Redundancy can save lives, but only if the mission planners happen to bring redundancy for exactly the right things. We have had space shuttle missions lasting only a few weeks and still seen failures. The ISS has remained viable only because of constant maintenance and resupply missions bringing fresh parts up from Earth. But here, everything the crew can rely on is whatever they carried with them on the day they first left home. On a 10-year journey with no possibility of resupply, what may degrade before the materials themselves is sometimes the certainty of the system. A modern spacecraft is not only metal, fuel, and machinery. It is also millions of lines of code quietly keeping everything in rhythm. And what is unsettling is that errors which never reveal themselves in the first half of the mission may begin to emerge only in the second. Cosmic rays can flip bits in memory, corrupting data or triggering abnormal behavior at precisely the worst possible moment. The onboard computers therefore have to be constantly checking themselves and correcting errors. But even those protective mechanisms are not, in turn, immune to failure. At the same time, the people aboard enter a different kind of erosion. The return leg lacks the rising sense of anticipation that comes with approaching a new world. Jupiter is already behind them, a completed achievement, while Earth remains years away. There are no new discoveries ahead, only a long return through repetition. Some worry that this may be the deepest psychological trough of all, when the great goal has already been reached, but the final reward is still unbearably distant. Depression, conflict among crew members, the fading of motivation, all of these may strike hardest during this phase. Even food, something that seems minor, can become a quiet and persistent strain. No matter how good the logistics plan is, the crew still has to live for years with a finite menu, and taste in space does not remain constant. Many astronauts have said that foods familiar on Earth become entirely different in microgravity. What was still edible in the first year may become hard to swallow by the 7th. For some submarine crews, it is precisely the monotony of meals that wears down morale more than almost any other factor. On a voyage this long, I do not think that observation sounds exaggerated at all. Then there is the trajectory, something that never allows the spacecraft to simply drift home. You cannot just point the nose toward Earth and let inertia do the rest. Over 5 years, the ship would have to perform periodic small burns to stay on the correct course. Every such correction eats into a finite supply of propellant already budgeted to the edge of feasibility. And while the outward journey faced cold and the scarcity of solar energy in the outer system, the return trip changes the nature of the threat entirely. The sun grows brighter, hotter, and closer day by day. From this point on, thermal management becomes a new battle. Radiators that were barely sufficient out near Jupiter may be driven to their limits as the spacecraft moves inward through the solar system. Heat accumulates in the cabin, adding pressure to systems that have already endured years of continuous stress. Outside the window, Earth changes from a fragile blue dot into a small disk, then into a familiar marble, and finally begins to feel like home again. But the more clearly home comes into view, the more everyone must confront the fact that the spacecraft is hurtling toward it at terrifying speed. Interplanetary trajectories do not end gently. The spacecraft will strike Earth's atmosphere at a velocity that would make even a meteor jealous. That is why re-entry is not something to work out at the last moment. It has to be planned months in advance. Where to aim, at what angle to approach, how much risk to accept in each option. Too steep, and the vehicle burns up. Too shallow, and it skips off the atmosphere and is thrown back into space. The margin for error is almost cruelly thin. Apollo re-entered at about 11 kilometers per second, but a return journey from Jupiter would be faster than that, significantly faster. One way to ease the burden of that final plunge is aerobraking, skimming through the upper atmosphere multiple times to bleed off speed gradually instead of forcing everything into one fiery descent. But every pass through the atmosphere heats the heat shield again, and each time the protective material wears away a little more. The entire problem becomes a delicate balance between the number of passes and the rate at which the heat shield deteriorates. If one had to choose the single most important component for the final stage, it would probably be the heat shield itself. It would have to endure 5 silent years in space through thermal cycling, radiation, and micrometeoroid impacts, and only at the very end, step forward to perform its most vital function. Any damage to it could become a death sentence. The lesson of the Columbia disaster was already painfully clear. When thermal protection fails, the rest of the engineering has almost no chance to recover. Only when the spacecraft comes near Earth does communication begin to regain its familiar meaning. The delays that once stretched across tens of minutes shrink to only a few seconds. Mission control can finally help in something close to real time. From that point on, weather becomes a decisive variable. No one can bring the spacecraft down in the middle of a storm. Backup landing sites have to be ready. Recovery teams must already be in position. But even so, the final approach is no longer truly a stage for human hands. No pilot has reflexes fast enough to manually fly a re-entry from interplanetary space. That task would have to be handed over entirely to computers, an automated system making thousands of adjustments every second to hold the correct entry angle, the correct orientation, the correct path. At that moment, the crew would be little more than bodies strapped into their seats, carrying all their hope in numbers that engineers on Earth had calculated many years before. And then re-entry begins, at an altitude of around 120 kilometers. The spacecraft cuts into the atmosphere at something like 14 to 15 kilometers per second. The air ahead of the heat shield is compressed so violently that it erupts into a brilliant white plasma, and from that moment on, error is no longer allowed to exist. By the time the spacecraft touches Earth's atmosphere, it is no longer flying, it is enduring. The temperature outside surges past 3,000 degrees Celsius. The air ahead is compressed into a blinding white glow, and the deceleration begins to pile onto the body. 3G, then 4G, then 5G. For a human being who has just spent 5 years in microgravity, even 3G alone would already feel like being crushed. And at that exact moment, communication disappears. The plasma sheath forming around the vehicle blocks all radio signals, pushing the spacecraft into several minutes of complete isolation. Mission control can only wait. Everything now rests in the hands of the pre-programmed guidance system. If anything goes wrong, No one will be able to help, and no one will even know until the spacecraft either emerges from blackout or never appears again. If it survives that phase, the spacecraft slows enough for the parachutes to deploy. But even that seemingly liberating moment offers no real relief. Those parachutes have been sitting motionless, tightly packed for more than 10 years. Has the material remained intact? Will the mechanisms deploy correctly? Can the lines withstand the violent jerk? Every one of those questions is answered in a single instant. Previous missions have failed at exactly this stage. Inside the capsule, the crew can do nothing but brace themselves for the brutal tug when the parachutes open, hoping the entire system is still faithful to what it was designed to do a decade earlier. The final descent may last around 15 minutes. It is a very strange 15 minutes, falling back to Earth after 10 years away, while the body no longer really belongs to this place. Bones have weakened, muscles have withered. The prospect of standing up, walking, even simply holding oneself upright, has become a luxury. The ground rushes closer faster than the sense of safety humans normally associate with it. Then impact comes. Still a real shock no matter how long everyone has been expecting it. After that comes stillness, silence. The hatch remains sealed while the recovery team approaches. The medical team has been tracking the entire descent during the final hour, but even now, they do not rush to open the capsule. The spacecraft lies motionless, perhaps in a desert, perhaps at a sea recovery point, depending on the chosen trajectory. From the outside, it is blackened like an object that has passed through fire. The heat shield has been worn away in places. Parachute lines are tangled around the structure. Sensors confirm that the life support system inside is still functioning, but protocol requires everyone to wait about 30 minutes to let the capsule cool, to let the system stabilize, and also because no one truly knows what they are about to face when the hatch opens. 10 years in space have forced the human body to adapt in ways that, until now, have mostly existed only in theory. Even from the medical data transmitted during landing, things do not look encouraging. Heart rates elevated, blood pressure fluctuating abnormally, accelerometers recording muscular tremors, but they are still alive. And at that moment, survival alone is already a profound piece of data. When the final seal is broken, the first air escaping from the capsule carries an unusual smell, not a toxic smell, but the scent of a sealed world that has sustained itself for a decade. Stale, confined, cycled through countless filters, faintly marked by chemicals outgassed from materials and the dim residues of human life accumulated in an enclosed space. The recovery team wears filtered masks not because they fear poisoning, but because that air has become alien. After so many years, the spacecraft has almost turned into an ecosystem of its own, to the point that Earth's atmosphere suddenly feels too sharp. The people returning cannot stand up. That had been expected for a long time. Even astronauts who spend only about half a year on the ISS often need assistance when they come back. Here, it has been 10 years. Despite exercise equipment, the muscles have still atrophied. Despite supplementation, the bones have still lost density. The cardiovascular system has forgotten how to fight against the weight of gravity. They are carried out on stretchers, and even that gentle motion is enough to trigger nausea. Sunlight is too bright. Their eyes have lived too long under carefully calibrated artificial light meant to replace the cycle of day and night. Natural light now feels like a floodlight pouring down on them. Even through shielding, the returning crew still manages to see a truly blue sky. Not through a window, not on a screen, but the actual sky. After years of looking only at Jupiter's bands of brown, grey and pale yellow, that blue appears almost violent, but at the same time, Earth immediately reveals the price of coming back. Normal 1G gravity suddenly feels like 3G. The body no longer has the physical memory for it. Every breath has to be taken deliberately. The heart pounds frantically, trying to push blood through a circulatory system that has grown accustomed to weightlessness. Even the short journey on a stretcher to the medical tent feels like being pressed under a continuous burden. Then the numbers begin to speak. Bone density scans show losses of around 30 to 40% in the load-bearing regions. The spine has actually lengthened from years without compression by gravity, but the price is damage to the intervertebral discs after such prolonged expansion. Back pain from this point on may become chronic, perhaps permanent. The quadriceps and calf muscles have visibly wasted away. Exercise equipment helped only in part, because there is simply no way to fully simulate the steady, unrelenting pressure of gravity. Muscle biopsies reveal deeper changes as well. The structure of the muscle fibers has shifted. Metabolism has changed. No one knows whether those changes can be fully reversed, because no one has ever undergone them on this scale before. Vision, too, shows obvious damage immediately. Long-duration spaceflight causes bodily fluids to shift upward, increasing intracranial pressure. The optic nerve becomes swollen. Visual sharpness declines. Some astronauts in the past have never fully recovered from that condition, and here the damage may be even worse. The medical team images the retinas, documenting every subtle change in the hope that it will become the basis for understanding future missions. In that moment, the person who has just returned is not only an astronaut, they are also a living experiment, a data point humanity has never had before. As for radiation, its full effects cannot yet be assessed. The dosimeters worn throughout the mission have recorded the total accumulated exposure, but the true biological consequences will reveal themselves only over time. It will take many more years before anyone can fully understand what the body has truly brought back from that journey. The hardest part of such a journey may not lie in the moment of passing through Jupiter's radiation or cutting into Earth's atmosphere, but in the years that follow, when the body begins to reveal the full price it has silently paid. The risk of cancer has increased by how much still depends on variables science does not yet fully understand. Cataracts are almost to be expected. Effects on cognition cannot be ruled out either. Before launch, all of those possibilities existed on paper, inside consent forms, written in cold, precise language. But abstract possibilities always carry a very different weight once they become a very real part of your own future. Cardiovascular measurements show that the body has truly been rewritten by weightlessness. The heart has shrunk slightly, as if it had forgotten the work of pushing against the weight of this world. Blood volume has dropped. Orthostatic intolerance becomes so severe that simply trying to raise the body into a seated position can make blood pressure fall dangerously, pushing the returning astronaut to the edge of fainting. Standing up, at that point, is not merely difficult. It is almost impossible, perhaps for weeks. The psychological evaluations come only later, once the immediate medical crisis has eased somewhat. And I think it is hard to imagine a questionnaire broad enough for an experience like that. How do you feel? What was the journey like? Did you notice anything unusual in your thoughts or emotions? All of it sounds too small. 10 years in a metal capsule with a handful of other people. 10 years looking at Jupiter's vast storms from a distance no human eye had ever known before. 10 years living with communication delays so long that every conversation with Earth felt like exchanging letters. 10 years carrying the knowledge that if something failed, no one would come to save you. And then, after all of that, still being alive to come back. Survival, in that context, is already a victory of its own. At launch, no one truly knew what the chances of mission success were. Some people estimated the odds of survival at only 50%. Others were even more pessimistic. So the simple fact of still breathing Earth's air, even if that air now feels harsh, oxygen-rich, and almost coarse compared with the carefully balanced mixture aboard the spacecraft, is itself something profound. But that survival opens onto another journey, one that is no less long or demanding: recovery. Time is measured not in days, but in many months, perhaps years. Bones need to bear weight again in order to rebuild density, but the body is not yet able to walk. Muscles need to regain mass, but they are not yet strong enough to support the body's own weight. The whole process resembles a locked circle that can only be undone through painfully slow progress. First comes therapy in water, where buoyancy lightens the burden of the body. Then parallel bars, where the arms must do the work the legs can no longer manage. and somewhere very far ahead lies the hope of walking without assistance. Even then, not everything is certain to return to what it was before. Bone density often stabilizes at a level lower than before the mission. Muscles may recover much of their bulk, but the changes that occurred at the cellular level may remain. Vision problems, too, are often not easy to reverse. And radiation is like a roll of the dice that was cast a very long time ago. The crew will continue to be monitored for decades, waiting to see which cancers may appear or may never appear. And yet this is also where the achievement of the journey becomes clearest. They reached Jupiter. They lived for a time in orbit around the largest planet in the solar system. They saw, with their own eyes, phenomena that humanity had previously known only through sensors and data. They brought back observations that could nourish science for generations. And perhaps most astonishing of all, they returned. While most missions to Jupiter end with the spacecraft being destroyed as Galileo was deliberately sent into Jupiter's atmosphere, and as Juno will one day meet the same fate, the fact that a human crew could come back almost feels like a reversal of the usual logic of outer solar system exploration. The price paid by the body does not diminish that achievement. It only makes its true cost visible. The public, of course, does not see the event in only one way. Some regard it as the summit of human exploration, a feat so extraordinary that completing it alone is enough to secure a place in history. But others look at the crew's medical condition and see proof that crewed deep space missions still lie far ahead of the point when they can truly be justified. The debate between human and robotic exploration therefore intensifies dramatically. For critics, the ravaged bodies of the returning crew are too clear an argument. For supporters, what they observed and brought home is evidence that human beings can still do things robots cannot yet reach. The returning astronauts suddenly become symbols for both sides, even though they themselves are probably still too weak to serve as symbols for anything at all. Interviews have already been arranged, but for now, even a short conversation is a burden. Long-duration spaceflight may slow information processing and reduce the ability to sustain attention. The brain, like the body, has to relearn how to live on Earth. Sound, smell, sight, the rhythm of a real planet, all of it crashes down at once on senses that have grown accustomed to the narrow and repetitive range of stimuli inside a spacecraft, until it becomes a kind of overload. The other crew members, if they too made it home, would each enter their own separate recovery. Some would fare better, some worse. Human responses to spaceflight vary enormously. Genetics plays a role, age plays a role. Pre-existing health conditions also leave their mark on the final outcome. The number of people who have experienced anything like this is still too small for science to speak with certainty, but a few patterns begin to emerge. Younger astronauts tend to recover faster. Those who began the mission with stronger bones usually retain more, and those with a higher baseline of physical fitness often rebuild muscle more quickly. But perhaps the deepest thing is not found in the clinical data at all. It lies in the bond among those who went through that journey together, a bond so profound that it can hardly be translated for anyone outside it, because in the end, no one else can truly understand what it means to live for 10 years in the void, to see Jupiter with your own eyes, and then to come home carrying a body that has been rewritten by the universe. What is hardest for those who remain on Earth to truly grasp may not be the numbers, but the feeling of living for 10 years with the knowledge that a single small failure could kill the entire spacecraft. That pressure is not loud, not cinematic in the way films imagine it, but constant, like a background layer that never disappears. And strangely, it coexists with moments that feel almost surreal. Jupiter's clouds rolling beneath your feet, the alien beauty of the Galilean moons, and a homesickness so persistent it becomes a kind of chronic pain. In the end, the crew brings back more than data. They bring back a kind of language that those who have never left Earth can almost never speak. That is why, when the mission debriefings begin and stretch on for months, what gets recorded is not only the performance of the machinery. Every detail is dissected. Which systems worked exactly as designed, how the humans responded, what malfunctions appeared that no one had predicted, and what lessons must be preserved for those who come after. The improvised fixes the crew was forced to devise in order to save the life support system will become engineering revisions for the next generation of spacecraft. The psychological strains they describe will go directly into the criteria for crew selection. The medical damage already visible in their bodies will become baseline data for future deep space missions. And there will be future missions. That is the important thing. The success of this journey, even if it had to be bought at too high a price, has proved the essential point. Human beings can travel to Jupiter and come back. That price does not erase the achievement. It only reveals the achievement in its true weight. In history, explorers have always paid in one way or another. Many never returned. This time, they did. From that point on, the rest of their lives changes role as well. The medical monitoring will not stop. Annual examinations, periodic assessments, regular meetings with mission medicine teams, all of it will continue for the rest of their lives. Their bodies become living laboratories for what deep space radiation and prolonged microgravity can do to a human being. It sounds cruel, but the injuries they carry are also useful. Every problem that appears in them may help prevent the same thing from happening to someone else in the future. And what surprises other people is that, even having seen the full price of it, they would still volunteer to go again if given the chance. Without hesitation, not because they fail to understand how much damage their bodies have sustained, or how long recovery will take, or how their life expectancy may already have been altered, but because, for them, Jupiter is no longer merely a destination, it is a doorway, and once you have crossed that doorway, it becomes very difficult to look at the universe in the old way again, because, in the end, the difficulty of returning from Jupiter does not lie only in engines, radiation, or bones. It carries an existential dimension as well. They have gone farther from Earth than almost anyone in human history. They have seen things that suddenly change the scale of humanity's place in the universe. They have lived with a level of isolation intense enough to redefine the word loneliness itself. They have lived close to death in a way that is concrete, ordinary, and daily. And then they return, only to find that the world beneath their feet has continued on without needing to wait for them. Perhaps that is why reintegration is even harder than recovery. The body will gradually relearn at least part of Earth, but the mind moves much more slowly. Everything here suddenly feels too crowded, too noisy, too rushed. People get irritated by traffic, by the weather, by small inconveniences. Meanwhile, you have just spent 10 years in a spacecraft where a single failed connector meant death, where every drop of water was calculated and nothing could be wasted. A shift in perspective like that does not easily reverse, and even the word home begins to feel strange. After 10 years away from Earth, is Earth still truly home? Or is home the place you once departed from, while the person who departed from it no longer exists in quite the same form? By the end of the journey, the spacecraft itself may have become the most familiar place of all. More familiar than Earth's gravity, more comfortable than the chaotic rhythm of a crowded planet. Perhaps home is no longer a location, but an idea. Or perhaps part of home was left somewhere around Jupiter, among the radiation belts, waiting for the next person to come and touch it. So if one had to measure the true difficulty of returning from Jupiter, it could not be measured only in delta V, radiation exposure, or percentage of bone density lost. It also lies in the distance between the person who left and the person who returned. Surviving long enough to come back is one thing. Coming back and still being yourself, that is perhaps no longer certain. But even when the story reaches that deeper layer, the technical reality never loosens its grip. Once the spacecraft leaves Jupiter's orbit, nearly every difficulty seems to double. Planning the way home is an orbital problem so complex that it requires months of calculation. The spacecraft must not only escape Jupiter's enormous gravity well, but do so in a way that places it precisely onto the long drifting path back to Earth. This is not a matter of backing out of a parking space. Jupiter's gravitational influence stretches across millions of kilometers, and breaking free of it alone demands almost perfect timing and an enormous amount of energy. The delta-V budget for the return leg is therefore comparable to or even greater than, the amount spent getting to Jupiter in the first place. Delta V, the change in velocity the spacecraft must generate through thrust returns here as the most merciless measure of all. Just to escape the planet's gravitational influence, the spacecraft needs about 9 kilometers per second, nearly equivalent to the energy required to launch from Earth's surface into low Earth orbit. In a very real sense, it is another launch, except this time the launch pad lies inside Jupiter's gravity well, and in that instant, the familiar problem appears again. To have enough thrust to get away, you must carry more fuel, and more fuel means more mass. At the scale of a journey leaving Jupiter to return to Earth, the rocket equation begins to show itself in its true, merciless form. More mass means more fuel. More fuel means even more mass. And when the problem is pushed up to the scale of a crude round-trip mission, chemical propulsion almost locks shut every exit. Without refueling, it is nearly impossible. And refueling at Jupiter, for now, remains a blank space no one yet knows how to fill. That is why return scenarios often turn to gravity assists as a way of trading simplicity for sophistication. Instead of merely burning fuel to escape, the spacecraft can skim past Jupiter's moons and borrow tiny portions of their orbital momentum. Ganymede, Callisto, Europa, names usually spoken of as scientific destinations now become stepping stones in an escape from that enormous gravity well. Each close flyby can add velocity without burning a single drop of propellant. But the price is that the precision must be almost absolute. Miss the target point by only a few kilometers, and the spacecraft may lose weeks, even months, simply correcting that error with further orbital adjustments. Navigation itself then becomes an entirely different world from what missions near Earth have ever known. At Jupiter's distance, a signal takes about 45 minutes to travel one way. A question sent to Earth and an answer sent back consumes roughly an hour and a half. Under those conditions, the very concept of real-time control simply collapses. Life-critical maneuvers have to be entrusted to the spacecraft itself. The onboard computers must make their own decisions in short, decisive moments, while Earth can only wait for confirmation that everything happened as it should. That means the autonomous guidance systems must not merely be good, they must remain reliable for years, with almost no room for error. The problem is that software is not sacred. Bugs hidden during the first half of the mission may reveal themselves only during its most critical phase. Remote updates are so slow that they can take hours. If hardware has failed, there is no way to replace it. So redundancy becomes a principle of survival. But the more systems are duplicated to guarantee safety, the heavier and more complex the spacecraft becomes, and the very effort to make it more reliable circles back into making the propulsion problem even harder. Meanwhile, the radiation does not stop simply because the spacecraft is preparing to go home. Every week spent around Jupiter, every scientific orbit, adds another layer of wear to the electronics. The RAD 750 processor in a guidance system can tolerate up to 1 million rad, which sounds enormous. But in Jupiter's radiation environment, such a dose can be eaten away in only a few weeks. Juno was designed for 8 orbits. A crewed mission, by contrast, would have to remain for months before leaving. More shielding is possible, of course. But then the familiar vicious circle closes again. Juno's 180 kilogram titanium vault protected only the most critical electronics, whereas a crewed spacecraft has to protect an entire living space. That shielding mass would not simply add linearly to the equation, it would make the entire propulsion problem swell in an almost brutal way. Then comes the moment of departure. You cannot leave whenever you want. Earth and Jupiter have to be in a favorable alignment so that the return trajectory does not consume excessive energy. Miss that window, and the spacecraft may be forced to wait many more months. And each extra month means more radiation, more consumption of supplies, more aging of the systems. Good opportunities for the return trajectory repeat only about every 13 months. And in this kind of mission, 13 months is long enough for every risk to rise in a very tangible way. There is another truth that is spoken less often. The way home is often longer than the way out. On the journey to Jupiter, the spacecraft can accumulate energy from its initial acceleration and from gravity assists from the inner planets. But on the return, it has to work against some of the very orbital dynamics that helped it before. The trip home is not a straight line drawn from Jupiter to Earth. It is a carefully shaped fall back toward the Sun, continuously adjusted so that it intersects Earth's orbit at exactly the moment Earth is present at that crossing point. Even hearing it described makes it clear that this is no longer intuitive mechanics, but a time-dependent three-body problem in which computational models must run through thousands of iterations just to find something that can be called an optimal solution. Some proposals go even further, suggesting the use of Venus as a gravitational way station on the route home. The spacecraft would swing past Venus, steal a little more momentum, and then reshape its trajectory back toward Earth. That approach saves propellant, but it pays for it with more years in space. A Vega-style chain Venus, Earth, Earth gravity assist may be mathematically feasible, but it is so delicate that arriving at Venus only a few hours off schedule could collapse the entire orbital structure. What looks elegant on paper is, in reality, always upheld by a precision that is almost inhuman. So attention turns again to nuclear propulsion, because at least there the promise of higher performance is clearer. A higher specific impulse means that each kilogram of fuel delivers more change in velocity. But nuclear power never brings only pure benefits. It comes with cooling systems, radiation risks from the reactor itself, and the familiar political controversies surrounding the launch of nuclear material from Earth. Since the 1960s, no nuclear propulsion system has actually flown beyond Earth orbit. Ion propulsion goes in the opposite direction. Its thrust is so small as to seem almost humble, yet persistent enough to build up velocity over months or years. Dawn used it to reach Vesta and Ceres. The price of ion thrust, however, is electrical power, a great deal of electrical power, and as far out as Jupiter, solar panels produce only about 4% of the power they would near Earth. To use that approach, you would either need solar arrays the size of a football field, or you would have to return once again to a nuclear reactor. Sometimes the most beautiful solution also sounds like the most fragile: in situ refueling. Mine water ice on Europa, split it into hydrogen and oxygen, and use those as fuel for the return journey. The idea has an almost perfect elegance to it. But the moment you begin counting the infrastructure it requires, it turns into a maze. You have to land. You have to mine. You have to build processing facilities. You have to lift the propellant from the surface back into orbit. And every new link in that chain brings with it countless new ways for the whole plan to fail. In the end, every question returns to the same knot. Propulsion and time are bound tightly together. The longer the mission lasts, the more radiation accumulates, the greater the probability of failure becomes, and the more supplies are consumed. But shortening the timeline demands more fuel. There is no clean solution here, only compromises weighed to their limit. And then, after many months spent around Jupiter, the moment that can no longer be delayed finally arrives. The sequence of burns for the return begins. The engines awaken after years of dormancy. There is no violent explosion like the departure from Earth, only a thrust that builds gradually and continues for hours, slow but heavy, as though the entire spacecraft were reluctantly lifting itself out of a gravitational abyss. The spacecraft trembles through the process. Propulsion systems that have lain silent for years are now being asked to perform their most important task again, and all anyone can do is hope that everything still works, as it did on the day it was designed. During that phase, every kilogram of fuel carries life or death meaning. Propellant management is no longer just a technical category. It is the boundary between getting away and being trapped forever. On the return journey, every kilogram of fuel carries almost life or death significance. The engineers have calculated that budget so tightly that there is almost no room left for intuition. Burn a little too much, and the spacecraft may not have enough for the corrections still to come. Burn a little too little, and it may remain trapped in Jupiter's gravitational shadow. Everything is therefore entrusted to a cold precision. Telemetry streams continuously into the autonomous systems. The thrust vector is trimmed little by little according to real-time data. Throughout the long journey home, mid-course corrections repeat again and again, small, but indispensable, and each one draws away a little more propellant from reserves that have already been guarded like a final lifeline. Then, after the escape phase, there are no more explosive moments of drama, only a long drift through the outer solar system. Jupiter gradually shrinks behind them, while the sun slowly brightens ahead. The spacecraft becomes a tiny artificial point of light, an island of warmth and illumination in a void that forgives nothing. It is precisely in this seemingly quiet phase that the life support system is tested most mercilessly. There is no resupply, no outside repair, only whatever the crew can keep functioning by themselves. Water, air, waste, every cycle has to be closed more tightly than anything humanity has ever been accustomed to. The ISS can recover about 93% of the water it uses, a number once considered extraordinary. But on this journey, 93% is not enough. Every kilogram of water that cannot be pulled back into the loop is a portion of reserves lost forever. Oxygen is generated by electrolysis, by splitting water into breathable gas and hydrogen. The hydrogen can be vented or used as part of the fuel supply. But electrolysis requires electricity, and electricity has never been abundant on a spacecraft that has lived too long under radiation. The solar arrays continue to degrade in performance exactly as the models warned they would, except reality always retains the right to be worse than prediction. The power budget therefore becomes so thin that it can scarcely tolerate any deviation at all. The carbon dioxide the crew exhales has to be removed from the cabin air. Chemical absorption systems are robust, but they consume replacement cartridges. Regenerative systems save mass, but demand additional power, and that is the essence of the entire mission. Everything is linked together in a closed chain of dependencies. Power sustains life support. Life support keeps the crew alive. The crew, in turn, is the only force left that can keep the spacecraft running. If a single link fails, the whole chain breaks. Food, in another sense, is even more merciless. It is a fixed mass lifted from Earth many years earlier, dried, vacuum-packed, stacked away, and rationed with meticulous care. But however compact it is made, a decade's worth of meals still occupies an immense volume. And after so many years, the problem is no longer whether there is enough to eat. The problem is that life has been stripped out of eating. The menu cycles repeat until variety vanished long ago. Meals gradually become a mechanical act, more like pumping fuel into a tank than a moment of living. Perhaps that is why, on the way home, the greatest challenge begins to shift from the technical to the psychological. On the outbound journey, there is always something ahead to anticipate. Jupiter is a promise, but on the return, that promise already belongs to the past. The mission's objective, in one sense, has already been fulfilled. What remains is only to survive long enough to get home, and that waiting stretches on year after year. Earth is still only a distant point of light. Communication is so delayed that dialogue almost dissolves into messages spaced days apart. You send out an experience and wait a very long time before anyone truly hears it. That very asynchrony creates a unique kind of emotional distance, as if you are still speaking to humanity, but no longer sharing the same rhythm of time with it. Within that cramped space, relationships do not remain unchanged either. The years wear away at patience. Things that once seemed small can expand into real conflict. Psychologists may have prepared for that, but preparation inside a simulator has never been the same as actually living together for years inside a spacecraft with no exit. The crew will eventually build their own coping mechanisms. Periods of solitude, structured social interactions, rules of reconciliation for when tensions flare. Some things work, some fail. No formula remains intact over that much time, and the spacecraft itself grows old in ways that can no longer be hidden. Systems designed for a 10-year lifespan begin to reach the edge of their limits. Components wear out. Backup systems activate automatically. Repairs become a daily habit. to the point that one might joke that the machine is being held together by improvisation and hope. And like many of the best jokes, it is funny only because it is too close to the truth. Radiation, meanwhile, continues doing its silent work. Shielding only reduces it. It never fully erases it. Galactic cosmic rays pass through almost everything, then generate cascades of secondary radiation inside the spacecraft itself. The body continues to accumulate exposure day after day, without sound, without warning. Biomarkers are monitored, and some of the trend lines begin to tilt in ways that make people uneasy. The solar cycle sometimes plays into that danger as well. During solar maximum, the stronger solar wind can incidentally block some fraction of galactic cosmic rays. During solar minimum, that protective veil thins. Mission planners may try to choose their timing to avoid the worst periods, but the sun has never promised to behave according to a human schedule. Meanwhile, the body keeps slipping further away from its original form. Even with daily exercise using resistance machines and cardiovascular equipment, the crew is only slowing the decline, not reversing it. Artificial gravity by rotation might help, but the engineering cost of that solution is so great that many designs leave it aside. Bones continue to lose density. Calcium no longer stays where it belongs, leaking gradually into the bloodstream and raising the risk of kidney stones. Muscle mass shrinks. The heart becomes accustomed to not having to fight against a planet's gravity anymore, and in doing so, becomes less suited for the day it must do exactly that again. Vision does not remain untouched either. Bodily fluids shift upward, changing intracranial pressure and pressing on the optic nerve. Some astronauts who spent only 6 months in microgravity already suffered lasting visual damage. Here, the exposure lasts for years. Glasses may help temporarily, but if the internal structures themselves have changed, what is lost may no longer be recoverable. Sleep, something that seems so simple, also becomes fragile. Without day and night following Earth's rhythm, the body has to live under artificial light cycles designed to replace them. They help to some degree, but not enough to fully deceive human biology. Fatigue settles like a persistent fog, never heavy enough to knock a person down, but never fully lifting either. And then, after all that, the spacecraft begins to re-enter the inner solar system. Mars's orbit falls behind. Earth's orbit gradually appears like a destination fixed years earlier. Navigation updates continue refining that intersection point through tiny corrections of only a few meters per second, but enough to determine the difference between return and disappearance. And as Earth draws nearer, something else slowly returns with it. Signal. The communication delay begins to shrink, as if after a very long time, the conversation with humanity is finally starting to resemble a real conversation again. As the spacecraft draws closer to Earth, one small change begins to carry enormous meaning. The distance within conversation starts to shrink. The communication delay is no longer 45 minutes. Then it falls to 30, to 20, to 10. Messages from mission control arrive more quickly, and what once felt like exchanging letters across a cosmic abyss begins to resemble real conversation again. That alone is enough to lift the crew's spirits. Earth stops being a vague idea at the end of the flight path. It becomes a place coming back into view. But just as that hope becomes clearest, the final challenge steps forward in its most merciless form. Returning does not mean becoming safer. Returning means plunging into the atmosphere at interplanetary speed. And at this stage, survival is determined by something brutally simple: atmospheric entry velocity. The spacecraft approaches Earth at around 12 to 14 kilometers per second, significantly faster than the Apollo capsules returning from the Moon at about 11 kilometers per second. That difference may sound small, but in the mathematics of heat, every additional kilometer per second makes the demands on the heat shield rise exponentially. That is why the re-entry corridor is almost like a narrow slit between two kinds of death. If the spacecraft comes in too steep, atmospheric friction will heat it beyond what the heat shield can withstand, and everything will burn. If it comes in too shallow, it will skip off the atmosphere like a stone skipping across water, then be thrown back into space with no longer enough fuel to try again. The entire safety window may be centered around roughly a single degree of entry angle, deviate by half a degree in either direction, and the cost may be death. That trajectory was calculated by people on Earth many years earlier. But every calculation, no matter how refined, still quietly assumes that the spacecraft will execute everything it is asked to do perfectly. Reality is never that clean. This is a machine that has spent years in Jupiter's radiation environment, then passed through many months in the inner solar system, accumulating countless tiny forms of wear along the way. The guidance sensors may have drifted slightly. The maneuvering thrusters may no longer deliver exactly the thrust they did on paper. The guidance computer may already carry distortions caused by radiation that no one has fully seen yet. That is why the final adjustments must begin weeks before the spacecraft actually touches the atmosphere. Not large burns, but tiny corrections. So small that they are almost nothing more than nudges to the entry angle by fractions of a degree. Navigation teams on Earth continue tracking the spacecraft from the ground, verifying the trajectory with every update. Command signals still take many minutes to arrive. The spacecraft performs the burn, and then both sides wait to see whether the effect matches what was intended. That process repeats until the entry path lies within limits that people dare to call acceptable. From that moment onward, almost all hope is entrusted to the heat shield. It is the only layer standing between the spacecraft and temperatures that may exceed those on the surface of the Sunday. When the most intense heating phase begins, plasma forms around the vehicle in a brilliant white glow, part fire and part a state of matter, entirely unlike anything humans know on the ground. And it is that same plasma layer that cuts communication. For several minutes, Mission Control loses all contact with the crew. At the most dangerous stage of the entire journey, the spacecraft is pushed back into solitude. That shield works by destroying itself in a controlled way. The ablative layers slowly vaporize, carrying heat away from the hull, exchanging their own sacrifice for the survival of everything behind them. Its thickness, therefore, is not just a simple number. Too thin, and it may burn through before re-entry ends, exposing the spacecraft's structure to plasma. Too thick, and it becomes excess mass that reduces payload or forces the spacecraft to carry more propellant from the very beginning. Engineers have calculated the optimal thickness through models, but models, as always, are only softened versions of reality. At roughly 120 kilometers above Earth's surface, re-entry truly begins. The first molecules of the atmosphere strike the hull. At first, the heating remains within the range that can be endured, but the lower the spacecraft descends, the denser the air becomes, meaning more collisions and a rapidly rising heat flux. Along with it comes deceleration, layer by layer pressing the crew harder into their seats. After years in microgravity, the return of G-forces does not feel like a return to normal. It feels as though the world itself is being laid on top of the body. A weakened cardiovascular system has to struggle to pump blood against that force. Vision narrows. Blood drains from the head, and in that condition, the people aboard still have to stay conscious, because if there is ever a moment when manual intervention is needed and consciousness slips away, the price may be the entire return itself. Then comes the vibration. Air tearing past at hypersonic speed creates shocks that travel through every structural element of the spacecraft. At first, the sound may faintly resemble a freight train, then thunder, then something beyond any comparison familiar on Earth. The seats shake so violently that even seeing the instruments clearly becomes difficult, and in that state, the only thing left is to trust that the automated systems are still holding the spacecraft in exactly the attitude it needs. After a few minutes, peak heating arrives. The exterior temperature climbs to around 3,000 degrees Celsius. Through the small windows, the heat shield appears like a glowing orange halo on fire. Inside, despite the insulation, the temperature rises noticeably. The cooling systems have to work at maximum power. A smell like something burning begins to seep into the cabin, not quite fire, but the scent of internal materials outgassing as they expand under heat. Then blackout comes. Mission Control's voice vanishes mid-sentence, swallowed by the plasma surrounding the hull. Everyone knew this moment would come. It was in the training, in the simulations, in every scenario prepared years in advance. But understanding something intellectually has never been the same as truly living through it. During those minutes, the spacecraft is a completely isolated fireball, plunging through the atmosphere, with no possible way to call for help if things begin to go wrong. The only thing saving them is that the re-entry profile was chosen long beforehand. The spacecraft does not dive straight down. It traces a long arc through the upper atmosphere, using aerodynamic force itself to bleed away speed gradually. That is another compromise. Lengthen the entry path to reduce the peak heat at the cost of enduring a greater total heat load. The engineers chose that path not because it was perfect, but because among imperfect options, it was the least merciless balance available. At the final stage of the journey, the spacecraft is no longer allowed even the slightest mistake. The guidance system has to hold its attitude within an almost cruelly narrow range, so that the heat shield remains pointed directly into the direction of motion. Deviate by only a few degrees, and unprotected parts of the hull could be exposed to the plasma. That is why the attitude control thrusters must work without pause, releasing tiny corrections, continuously burning through a significant fraction of a propellant supply that has already shrunk to a level everyone fears. The atmosphere does the rest. Drag begins to strip velocity away from the spacecraft, turning kinetic energy into heat with an almost perfect indifference. The vehicle slows second by second, but that slower speed is still deep in the hypersonic regime. Shock waves wrap around the hull, compressing the air so abruptly that it begins to glow, and with that light come ever greater G-forces. At first only 2 or 3 times Earth gravity. Then, as the spacecraft pushes deeper into denser air, the deceleration spikes sharply. 6, even 8 G at the peak. Vision narrows. Breathing grows heavy. Even lifting an arm feels like dragging an enormous weight. In that condition, the only thing the crew can do is try to stay conscious and watch the systems that are not yet permitted to betray them. Everything depends on the heat shield. Its ablative material vaporizes away layer by layer, leaving behind a boundary layer of gas like a thin cushion between the plasma and the hull. It protects by consuming itself, but that rate of consumption has never been a completely certain number. If the real environment is only slightly harsher than the models predicted, the shield may erode faster, and then whatever is exposed behind it will have no chance against those temperatures. The sensors embedded in the shield continue transmitting data throughout the process. The numbers climb. 2,000 degrees, 2,000, 500, then 3,000. And after that, they hit the limit of their own ability to measure. The data flattens out. From that moment on, the crew is almost flying blind, not because there are no instruments, but because every instrument has reached its own boundary. There is only one thing left to hold on to: the belief that the people who designed the spacecraft left enough margin for safety. The plasma does not only block communication, it also disturbs the electronics. Electromagnetic interference sweeps through the systems, causing some instruments to read erratically, forcing backup layers to stand ready to take over if the primary ones fail. In theory, the crew has been trained for manual control scenarios. But at interplanetary re-entry speed, human reflexes simply are not fast enough. They still need the computers, even if that means placing their fate in a system that has already gone through too many exhausting years. The minutes of blackout stretch in a warped way. Every second feels elongated. Inside the cabin, people count heartbeats to estimate the passage of time, clinging to meditation and breathing control techniques learned long ago for precisely a moment like this. Not to make fear disappear, but to keep the mind from coming apart under the roar, the shaking, and the crushing weight pressing over the whole body. Then communication returns. Suddenly, like a slit of light opening. From the layer of static, Mission Control's voice appears again. They are receiving telemetry once more. Heart rate, breathing rate, markers of biological stress, all of it lights up on their screens almost at the same instant that the crew feels it in their own bodies. The data confirms what everyone already knew without machines. The strain is extreme, but at the same time, It confirms something more important. They are still alive. The spacecraft has passed through peak heating. The velocity continues to fall. At last, the spacecraft drops below the speed of sound. The roar gradually softens, from something beyond language, back into thunder that can at least be endured. The G-forces fall to a level where the body is no longer being crushed. Vision opens again. Arms stop feeling like lead. And when everything begins to resemble a descent rather than a struggle not to burn up, the drogue chutes deploy first, pulling the spacecraft into a stable attitude and bleeding off speed step by step. Then the main parachutes burst open above, creating a violent jolt. But compared with what has just happened, that jolt feels almost gentle. Now the spacecraft is no longer tearing through the atmosphere. It hangs in the air, swaying beneath the parachutes. Through the window, the crew can see blue sky, not the black backdrop of space, but a real sky with depth, with atmosphere, with clouds drifting across it. After so many years living only in vacuum and looking at worlds through glass, they have almost forgotten what it feels like to be inside an atmosphere that looks like this. The altitude falls steadily. The instruments show that the descent rate is still within nominal limits. The parachutes are working exactly as they are supposed to. The landing systems prepare for the final touchdown, whether it is on land or at sea. But either way, the ground still arrives with enough force to compress every shock absorber. For an instant, everything not strapped down is thrown upward. Then silence falls. A strange silence, almost impossible to believe. They are on Earth. The mission has succeeded. Re-entry is over. But even when the spacecraft is motionless, another challenge appears immediately. The body must face full gravity again for the first time in nearly 10 years. The recovery team will arrive within minutes if it is a splashdown, or later if the vehicle has landed on some remote patch of land. They approach very carefully, because the hull is still hot, toxic propellant may still be leaking, and the dangers are not ones to take lightly. When the hatch opens, Earth enters first as smell. That is what overwhelms them almost immediately. The scent of vegetation, soil, salt water, and even the machinery of the recovery vehicles. All of it is dense, rich, and vividly alive in a way that feels almost violent compared with the endlessly recycled air aboard the spacecraft. Then comes the moment when they must step outside, or more precisely, be helped outside. Their legs no longer have the strength to hold up their bodies. Muscle atrophy and bone loss have made standing impossible. The astronauts collapse into the arms of the recovery team and are lowered onto stretchers. Everyone knew this would happen, but knowing it in advance does not make the feeling of helplessness any less severe. Sunlight touches their skin like something entirely new, not because they have never been near the sun, but because light filtered through Earth's atmosphere carries a different quality, warmer, thicker, more present than memory. Medical examinations begin almost at once. Heart rate, blood pressure, neurological status, blood samples, everything is recorded with an urgency that is partly treatment and partly documentation. Their bodies are now not only the bodies of people who have just survived, they are also the first reference standard for an experience humanity has never truly completed and returned from before. That data will end up in the hands of those who design the missions of the future. Transfer to a specialized medical facility happens very quickly. Aircraft, recovery vessels, then a rehabilitation center. And during that journey, Earth passes by the window like something almost surreal. Trees, houses, people living out their ordinary days. After years of seeing only spacecraft interiors and celestial bodies through glass, everything familiar suddenly becomes strange. So the return does not happen in a single moment, but begins as a slow and lengthy process. From that very point on, the body has to relearn the simplest thing that once belonged to it naturally: how to live under Earth's gravity, and force the cardiovascular system to remember how to push blood upward against the pull of an entire planet. Return does not end when the spacecraft touches down. For the human body, it is only just beginning. Everything has to be learned again from the start, at a pace so slow it feels almost cruel. Muscles have to grow strong again. Bones must struggle to recover the density they quietly lost through those long years of weightlessness, though no one dares say with certainty whether full recovery is still possible. In the first days, physical therapy is almost nothing more than the effort to sit upright for a few minutes. Even that is enough to send the heart racing, the vision dimming, the body exhausting itself before it has to lie down again and wait to recover. Then, little by little, the time spent sitting upright grows longer. After that comes standing with assistance. Only then come steps taken while being supported. But even then, the body feels as though it is living inside the wrong frame of reference. The vestibular system, deep inside the ear and once responsible for telling a person what is up and what is down, has adapted too long to microgravity. Now it has to relearn the constant pull of Earth. Simply standing still can cause dizziness. Walking can trigger nausea. The room feels as though it is turning by invisible rhythms. Everything improves only very slowly, and there is always the possibility that some part of that disorientation may remain forever. Strength returns faster than bone. Resistance exercises are increased step by step. Within a few months, the body may learn to walk again without assistance. Within about a year, strength may approach something close to its pre-flight level. But bone is more stubborn. It needs years, and even then it may never truly return to what it once was. And radiation, the thing that leaves no dramatic mark at first, continues writing its part into the future. Medical monitoring programs have to follow signs of cancer, cardiovascular changes, neurological decline. Some things appear early, such as cataracts caused by radiation damage within a few years. Other effects may take decades to reveal themselves. From that point onward, medical surveillance is no longer just a post-mission phase. It becomes the rest of a life. But sometimes the harder challenge does not lie in the body, but in how to go on living with what one has experienced. Those who returned have gone farther from Earth than anyone before them. They have lived through isolation, danger, and severity far beyond the familiar range of human experience. That is why Earth after return is not merely a place. It is also a sensory shock. Too crowded, too loud, too many voices, too many vehicles, too many layers of ambient noise pressing in at once. Social situations become harder. Finding meaning in the smallest pieces of ordinary life also becomes stranger after having lived so long beside questions large enough to fill the universe. Relationships, for that reason, do not escape distortion either. Some marriages do not survive that distance, because the person who comes back is no longer the same person who left, and they themselves know that more clearly than anyone. They continue giving interviews, writing reports, debriefing mission designers. Every system failure, every improvised workaround, every situation no one foresaw is preserved as data. Those who go later will be safer in part because of their wounds. And then that question returns, again and again. Was it worth it? The answer is not always the same. On some days, the answer is yes. Absolutely worth it, because they expanded humanity's understanding, because they crossed a boundary once thought impossible. But on other days, the answer is no, when the cost stands too clearly in view. Health, relationships, youth, and a portion of one's life spent inside a metal tube crossing the void. Perhaps, as this passage suggests, there is already something wrong in the way the question is framed, because some things human beings do are not really governed by a balance sheet of cost and benefit. We climb mountains, cross oceans, go into space not only because the arithmetic says we should, but because something in our nature keeps pulling outward, beyond the known, toward the next horizon. Their bodies keep the marks of that journey forever. Bone density never fully recovers. Vision has changed. Radiation has left its imprint in DNA. But in exchange, they have seen things that can hardly be traded for anything else. Jupiter's clouds at a distance human eyes can truly touch. Auroras lit by magnetic fields strong enough to kill them. Absolute isolation, absolute self-reliance, and absolute devotion to the mission and to one another. From that foundation, later journeys will be built. Engineers will become better at radiation shielding. Biologists will find more effective countermeasures against microgravity. Psychologists will refine how people are chosen and how they are supported before, during, and after the mission. Every crew will stand on the shoulders of those who came before. That is why the difficulty of returning from Jupiter has never been only a mechanical problem. It is also biological, psychological, and at a deeper level, existential. Such a journey changes a person at the foundation. The one who lands is no longer the one who departed. Whether that is growth or damage is perhaps a question only each astronaut can answer for themselves. But the greatest legacy of the mission may reach even beyond the people who survived it. Every packet of telemetry the spacecraft sent back was dissected by engineers around the world. They tracked how radiation-induced charging eroded components over time, which circuit boards failed after 3 years, which forms of shielding truly protected the core, which materials endured best under the rain of high-energy particles. The spacecraft itself remained in Jupiter orbit, still quietly transmitting data until its final systems gave way. And even that slow decline had value. When the backup processor began to fail, how much longer the secondary systems lasted than the primary ones, which structures retained their integrity best under radiation. All of it became raw material for longer missions in the future. Even the shielding problem changed because of what this journey left behind. The nearly 200 kilogram radiation vault that once protected the electronics is now only a starting point, no longer the final standard. From there, people began thinking in terms of new composites, specialized polymers, layered shielding systems that might deliver better protection per kilogram of mass. In that sense, this mission established the first real baseline for how much protection human beings minimally need in order to survive inside Jupiter's magnetosphere. The life support data also brought back surprises of its own. Some systems performed better than all predictions, while others revealed their limits earlier than expected. The water recovery network, for example, sustained 98% efficiency throughout the entire mission, exceeding its original design. But the oxygen generation system declined gradually, forcing the crew to perform maintenance more often than planned. The CO2 scrubbers also needed replacement sooner than the models had forecast. It is precisely from these deviations that future technology begins to push farther toward closed ecosystems that can supplement purely mechanical systems, with algae tanks that both convert CO2 into oxygen and generate edible biomass. And the medical data is almost beyond price. Bone scans taken before the mission, during it, and after return begin to reveal the pattern of calcium loss and recovery in the human body at a scale never seen before. Muscle biopsies show which fiber types deteriorate fastest, which exercise regimes preserve strength most effectively. Cardiovascular monitoring describes how the heart changed through each phase of the mission. And then there is radiation, the data that leaves people least at ease. The real total exposure dose turned out to be nearly 30% higher than predicted, and most of that excess came from passing through Jupiter's radiation belts. The return leg, thanks to a different trajectory, resulted in a lower dose, but that very difference became a new lesson. Sometimes the way home is not merely the path of retreat, but the place where humanity begins to truly learn how to survive inside a world that was never made for it. What people drew from the mission after the return was not only orbital data or biomedical charts, but also a deeper understanding of how human beings actually bend under pressure and then adapt to it. Mission planners looked at that journey and began accepting a different trade-off. Fly longer, if that means avoiding more radiation. Future trajectories were therefore redrawn, no longer optimized absolutely for time, but for probability of survival. The psychological side also turned out to leave behind more than expected. The crew maintained an extraordinary degree of cohesion, but signs of strain still surfaced in fairly clear cycles. The communication delay with Earth, which at first had seemed like little more than an operational inconvenience, ended up scraping much more deeply at the mind than anyone had imagined. Being unable to consult Earth immediately during emergencies created a long, low-burning anxiety, and when one crew member fell ill, the whole group was forced to confront fully the reality that no one from outside was coming to save them. That moment fundamentally changed the way they treated one another. From that point on, Psychologists began refining how people would be selected for later journeys. They looked for personality traits tied to surviving prolonged isolation. They reconsidered the whole support system, virtual reality environments to give the mind a place of refuge, AI companions for conversation without judgment, structured activities sufficient to keep life on board from collapsing into a void of meaning. But even then, the data still captured only part of the picture. There are lessons numbers cannot quite touch. For instance, how much a human being can endure if they believe what they are doing truly matters, or how a person only discovers, once pushed to the edge, how much patience, endurance, and unnamed determination they still possess. At the same time, the mission exposed an uncomfortable truth. With current technology, everything was only just enough to reach Jupiter, no more than that. Every part of the system operated at the edge of what it could do. Radiation shielding only barely met the minimum. The life support system had almost no margin for safety. Propulsion locked the entire mission architecture into a rigid corner. Communication was so slow that it severed the possibility of real-time coordination with Earth. That picture made one thing clear: future missions will not be possible through incremental improvements alone. They will require genuine breakthroughs. Nuclear propulsion could shorten the flight time, which would mean less radiation and less psychological erosion. New materials could provide better shielding without adding too much mass. Artificial gravity through rotating habitats could save bones and muscles from prolonged deterioration. Closed biological systems could reduce dependence on everything that has to be carried from Earth. And then there are ideas that still sound as though they have stepped out of fiction. Generating an artificial magnetosphere around the spacecraft to deflect charged particles, placing the crew into some form of metabolic hibernation to conserve supplies and reduce mental strain, or developing medical interventions advanced enough to repair radiation damage as it happens. What this mission accomplished was to transform those ideas from interesting options into almost mandatory conditions. To keep sending humans to Jupiter without advances like that would, in effect, mean accepting Mirosh that there will be casualties, that the human body will be permanently damaged, that some people may not come back. That is the kind of price mission planners, ethics boards, and the public are not willing to accept. Economics is no kinder than physics. More than $50 billion were consumed by this mission alone, and most of that money went into development, system design, component testing, and building redundancy into every smallest layer of the spacecraft. Launch costs added billions more. Then there was an entire decade of mission operations with ground teams, infrastructure support, and the maintenance of the entire machine back on Earth. Without fundamental change, later missions will face that same mountain of cost all over again. Only when reusable rockets become cheap enough, when assembling large spacecraft in orbit becomes more routine, when staged fuel depots begin to exist, and when automation reduces the burden of human labor on the ground, might that equation become even slightly less harsh. But then, as this passage emphasizes, the greatest barrier may still lie not in technology or money. It lies in the almost unavoidable question: why send humans to Jupiter at all? Robots can do science at lower cost, lower risk, and without forcing anyone to endure radiation, isolation, or an almost impossible return journey. Machines do not need oxygen. They do not need sleep. They do not break down psychologically. They do not need rescuing. In purely cold terms, their argument is very strong. The argument for human beings, therefore, has to stand elsewhere. Not in claiming that humans are safer or cheaper, but in the fact that humans still possess abilities machines have not reached. Humans improvise in the face of surprise. Humans make intuitive leaps that do not exist inside pre-programmed responses. Humans ask questions that a machine would never naturally think to ask. And above all, humans do not merely observe the world. Humans experience it. This mission is the embodiment of that position. The crew did not simply gather data about Jupiter. They lived through Jupiter. They looked at those masses of cloud with human eyes, took them in through human consciousness, and felt the weight of standing before the largest planet in the solar system in a way that can never be fully compressed into a spreadsheet. Of course, to many people, that argument is only romanticism. They say high-resolution video is already enough for experience, that remotely operated robots can do better than astronauts in protective suits around Jupiter's moons, that nothing in the subjective feeling of a human being is worth billions of dollars, and the deliberate placing of a life at such an extreme edge of danger. That is why the debate has never really quieted. It continues in academic papers, congressional hearings, and public forums. And the paradox is that this very mission provides arguments for both sides. Supporters point to the achievements, to the situations the crew managed that automation might have failed to handle, and to the inspiration the journey created. Critics point to the cost, the health damage, and the possibility that the scientific return may not be proportional to the price that was paid. Perhaps the truth does not sit neatly with either side. There are missions where humans must be present. There are missions where they need not be. Mars, given the communication delay and the long-term ambition of settlement, will perhaps eventually require humans. But with Jupiter, the case is far more ambiguous. And even those who have actually flown there no longer hold the same certainty they once did. While they were still on the spacecraft, they almost never questioned the value of the mission. When survival depends on getting through each day, keeping the systems running, carrying out experiments, the purpose feels self-evident. Doubt then resembles a luxury, even a kind of weakness. But later, during recovery, when the body slows down and the mind finally has room to look backward, the question returns, was it worth it? They traded health, time, and relationships for experience, knowledge, and achievement. That balance sheet does not close easily. Some losses cannot be matched equally against gains. And some experiences were never, from the beginning, the kind of things that belonged inside a cost-benefit analysis at all. There were times when they sat in auditoriums, listening to scientists present discoveries built directly from the data they had carried home. The structure of Jupiter's magnetic field in unprecedented detail, newly explained atmospheric dynamics, hypotheses about the mechanisms behind auroras stronger than anything Earth has ever known. At those moments, it was hard to deny that they had helped expand human knowledge. Then they would go to another room, where engineers were designing the next spacecraft, and be shown better radiation shields, new life support prototypes, propulsion concepts that might cut years from the journey. Those people asked about what it felt like to pass through Jupiter's magnetosphere, about the moment a system first began to drift out of specification, about the things technical documents could never teach. There was a very deep satisfaction in that. Their pain was genuinely being transformed into something useful. But those same meetings also carried a quiet disappointment, because every problem this mission exposed was the kind that takes decades to solve. They will not yield to a quick patch or the next budget cycle. And so, even though the mission proved that humans can go to Jupiter and return, the next crewed journey there still will not leave the launch pad for at least another 20 years, perhaps much longer. What unsettles those who return most is not only what they endured, but the possibility that everything may fade into silence too quickly. The technologies needed for the next stage still do not exist. The funding for what comes next is uncertain. Public attention, as usual, has already begun to drift away as new concerns arise. The story feels so familiar that it is almost a law of exploration history. A great feat happens, the world is shaken for a moment, and then it falls quiet before anyone truly knows what to do with it. There have been moments like this before. Columbus's voyages opened the possibility of crossing the Atlantic, yet it took many decades before sustained continuity followed. Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in 1927, but commercial aviation did not instantly become ordinary because of it. Apollo brought humans to the moon in 1969, and yet from 1972 until now, no one has gone back. Thinking of those examples, it is hard not to wonder whether the Jupiter mission will become the same kind of moment, a summit that proves humanity can do it, but does not guarantee that history will truly keep moving forward from there. It is precisely that uncertainty that hurts, because after paying such a price, the natural question comes, did I endure all of this for something that will stand alone in history? Will that journey remain only a solitary triumph, astonishing, but not truly redirecting the future? Or is it quietly setting larger movements in motion, changes that those who lived through it cannot yet see, changes whose shape will emerge only decades later? There is no answer yet. History always reacts more slowly than human pain. Even so, there is one thing that hardly needs time to confirm it. Returning from Jupiter is one of the hardest things humanity has ever done. Not only hard in the technical sense, but hard in every sense. It pushes engineering beyond all precedent, drives human physiology to the edge of breaking, and subjects mental endurance to a test that almost no one previously had the chance to experience. Surviving such a journey cannot be described with a single word. It is skill, it is willpower, and it is also luck, a quantity of luck so large that even the survivor cannot pretend it was absent. The future may be less merciless. Technology will improve. Experience will accumulate. These lessons will thin out some of the uncertainty. But I think there are things that will never become ordinary. Jupiter is too far away. Its radiation is too violent. The isolation there is too absolute. No matter how advanced the next generation of spacecraft becomes, going there and coming back will still remain one of the most extraordinary efforts humanity can mount, something that demands both the finest people and the most sophisticated technologies a civilization can build. Those who return therefore carry two layers of marks within them. One lies in the body, injuries that do not disappear. The other lies in memory, where certain images are strong enough to wake them in the middle of the night. The moment of realizing that Earth had become only a tiny blue point, almost unbelievably small. The day a life-critical system failed without warning and they had to struggle for 18 straight hours to save it, knowing perfectly well that failure meant death. Or the slow stretch period on the way home, when every month, every week, every day was counted as though only by counting it could they preserve the feeling that home still lay ahead. But not everything they bring back is a wound. There is pride, of course. But beyond that, there is a rarer kind of fulfillment. Something that appears only when a human being completes something truly difficult, not merely impressive on paper. There is gratitude for having seen the world from a vantage point almost no one else has known. There is a reverence for Earth, its atmosphere, its gravity, its abundance that only those who have gone far enough away can fully feel. And beyond personal emotion, there is another form of understanding, almost ontological in nature. They no longer merely know that Earth is fragile, isolated, and precious. They have felt it instinctively. From Jupiter's distance, this planet is only a pale blue point fading into the dark background of the universe. Once you have seen it that way, it is very hard to see it in the old way again. When they appear in public, people often ask about the hardest moments, and those who returned usually answer in the language listeners can most easily absorb. Radiation calculations, life support failures, orbital corrections, technical numbers, those are correct answers, but not the whole truth. Because the hardest part was not necessarily one single crisis. It was the accumulated weight of separation, and the feeling that never left them, that survival depended on machines having to work perfectly for years without once being allowed to let go. Children, though, ask entirely different things. They want to know what they ate, how they slept, what space smelled like. It sounds naive at first, but in truth those are questions very close to the future. Because if people cannot imagine what life beyond Earth actually looks like, they will never truly support the missions that make it real. When those who return speak of recycled water, mandatory exercise hours, the small ways they found entertainment inside the spacecraft, space exploration stops being a purely distant idea. It begins to take on the shape of lived life. Scientists enter from the opposite direction. They want the telemetry, the hardware performance, the physiological fluctuations, everything measurable. In their eyes, the body of a human who survived that journey is an unprecedented experimental platform. where every blood sample, every bone scan, every cognitive test contributes something to the foundation of later missions. It may be that this medical data is one of the greatest legacies of the entire expedition. Engineers, meanwhile, look elsewhere, at the places where the systems did not behave as the models predicted, the components that reacted outside expectations, the small failures that did not kill anyone but taught a great deal. Radiation shielding behaved differently than expected. Life support recycling performed worse than hoped. Communication delay imposed greater operational strain than the plans had admitted. All of those differences were purchased with real pain, but in return, they help those who come after avoid repeating exactly the same mistakes. Psychologists also search for their part of the mission. They want to know what prolonged isolation truly does to a human being. Those who returned have to describe their inner journey, the initial excitement, then the repetitive rhythm, then boredom, then periods drifting close to despair. Some things helped: strict schedules, communication with Earth, creative activities, and some things were almost useless slogans about the greatness of exploration, reminders that the whole world was watching, or abstract rhetoric about humanity's mission. What kept them standing, in the end, was not the loftiest ideals, but the clarity of purpose immediately in front of them. Not enduring for some vague concept, but for something concrete. The next measurement, the next maintenance procedure, the next communication window, the next step for those who would come after. When despair drew near, it was precisely those goals small enough to grasp that became psychological anchors. Concrete things held human beings together, while things too large sometimes became too heavy to carry. And perhaps that is also one of the most uncomfortable truths this mission reveals. Not every success feels easy when looked at afterward. There are missions that fail spectacularly and therefore force the world to look at them. There are also missions that succeed, but whose very success exposes a much harder question: whether the price human beings must pay is something a civilization is truly willing to accept in order to keep going. The bitterest part of this success is that it does nothing to soften the truth. The mission completed all of its primary objectives. The crew returned safely. Technically, no one can deny that it was a triumph. But precisely because the success was so complete, it also exposed without mercy what exploring Jupiter truly demands. Radiation left its mark. Bone was lost in ways not easily undone. The mind was stretched across a strain that, until then, had existed mostly in theory. These were not accidents outside the plan. They were the most precise measurement of the price that had to be paid. Technology may one day make that price less cruel. Better propulsion systems could shorten the journey, and in doing so reduce both radiation exposure and the time the body is eroded by microgravity. Shielding may become more effective. Life support systems may become more humane, with better food, more livable habitats, and forms of recreation that make a confined spacecraft feel less like an extended psychological trial. But even in the most optimistic vision, the basic adversaries remain: distance, isolation, and radiation. Technology may bargain with them. It cannot make them disappear. That is why the argument against sending humans to Jupiter has never been weak. Robots are cheaper, tougher, and less risky. They do not need oxygen, water, or sleep. They do not fall ill. They do not collapse under loneliness. And most importantly, they do not need to be brought home. It is a very solid argument, but it still leaves out something that is difficult to measure in cost. Human beings improvise in the face of surprise in ways machines still cannot. Human judgment works well in ambiguity, where pre-programmed responses begin to fail. And there is one more thing that cannot be ignored. The presence of human beings makes these journeys resonate with the public in ways robotic missions rarely can. This mission was clear proof of that. Millions of people followed it through social media, news coverage, and documentaries. Children drew the spacecraft in their school notebooks. Teachers used it to talk about science and courage. Politicians invoked it in speeches as a symbol of national capability. For a time, society seemed to genuinely look upward. and that attention alone was powerful enough to preserve funding for parts of the space program that might otherwise have been cut. But the world always moves faster than a single achievement. Only 2 years after the return, the spotlight on the mission had already dimmed noticeably. Other crises pushed ahead: economic instability, political conflict, environmental disasters. Space returned to its familiar place in public consciousness, very important, but not urgent. That says more about people on Earth than it does about the true value of those journeys. Even so, behind the scenes, the story did not stop. Space agencies continued thinking about Jupiter, because this mission had answered the most fundamental question: human beings can go there and come back. From now on, the problem is no longer whether it can be done, but how to make something that was once a heroic feat no longer depend so heavily on willpower and luck. How to make it safer, more sustainable, more practical. Some imagine a gradual path forward. First, automated cargo spacecraft delivering resources in advance, then crewed missions that no longer have to carry everything from Earth, and further still, permanent research stations around Jupiter or its moons. Those ideas still sound very distant, but this mission took the first step that made them no longer entirely unfounded. And yet, when that question comes back to the people who actually went, the answer is never fixed. Would they do it again, knowing the full cost in advance? Right after returning, when the body was still broken and the mind still exhausted, the answer would probably have been no. But as the years pass, and pain stops occupying the whole field of view, another answer begins to emerge. Because there are experiences that, even when paid for with many things, still leave behind a source of meaning that is not easily replaced by any ordinary achievement. The feeling of having done something truly difficult becomes something that supports a person in their darkest moments, especially because the costs never fully disappear. Joints ache from the long-term effects of calcium loss. Periodic checkups reveal new hints of radiation-related risk. Nightmares still pull them back into emergency hours on the spacecraft with the warped intensity of memory during sleep. But even in those moments, there remains a stubborn belief that the price they paid was conscious, voluntary, and paid for something large enough to matter. Too many people destroy their health for things far smaller than this. Here, they did it for an effort that truly carried weight. Families, of course, cannot be made whole again simply by a landing. A spouse has aged 3 years over the course of 10 years of separation, a small difference on a calendar, but strange and painful in emotional terms. Children grew up largely without that person being there, forming habits, attachments, and absences that cannot be repaired by one late embrace. Some relationships have to learn how to exist again. Some never recover their old form. Others become stronger after passing through something almost no one can imagine. Friendships change as well. Some people stayed in contact faithfully throughout the journey, becoming psychological lifelines of greater value than they themselves may ever have realized. Others quietly drifted away, either because they could not reach into that experience or because they did not know where to stand in relation to the attention it brought. In return, new friendships formed with people in the same orbit of life. Astronauts, engineers, scientists, people who understand the cost of a journey like that without needing much explanation. Those relationships often become deeper than ordinary friendships rarely do. Then time finishes the rest. Someone who once signed up for the mission out of curiosity and personal ambition gradually becomes a name in school textbooks. In some way, that feeling is almost unreal. A deeply personal adventure turns into a historical event. A single person's subjective memory is pulled into the objective language of civilization. Historians will debate it for many years. Was this truly the turning point that carried humanity beyond Mars, or merely an expensive feat that failed to redirect the world? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. This mission is large enough to be remembered, but not large enough to shift history on its own. And in the end, perhaps what matters more than the way history names it is what it actually accomplished. The measurements, the systems tested to their limits, the experiences recorded in the human body itself, all of it becomes part of the knowledge the future will need, whether that future returns to Jupiter or turns in another direction. But even then, the hardest part of the journey lies somewhere else entirely from all the technical graphs. Not the radiation, not the isolation, not the bone loss or the wasting of muscle. The hardest part, in the end, is coming back and realizing that Earth, though it is still the place you began, is no longer entirely home. You have seen too much, gone too far, been rewritten by the journey in a way that cannot be undone. Part of that person is still out there, continuing to drift around Jupiter in memory, watching Earth shrink and disappear into darkness. That part never truly returns. And perhaps it is only when one can accept that one truly understands what it means to have come home. What people bring back from Jupiter is not exactly trauma, at least not only that. It is more like a permanent shift in the axis of how they see the world. After living through a journey like that, the small complaints of Earth begin to sound like a different language. Meanwhile, the simplest things, a breath of air that has never passed through a filter, a real shaft of sunlight, a faucet turned on without calculation, become so profound that they are almost impossible to explain to someone who has never left. In that sense, those who return no longer fully belong to Earth. But neither do they truly belong to space. They live in a strange in-between region, suspended between two worlds, and that in-betweenness brings with it some unusual gifts. They begin to see connections that others miss, patterns hidden beneath things that seem unrelated. The long years spent keeping complex systems from collapsing under life or death pressure leave them with a particular intuition for solving problems. That is why people come to them not only to ask about Jupiter, but about risk, about making decisions in uncertainty, about how to keep the mind sharp when a challenge lasts long enough to wear away every easy instinct. And then there is another thing that changes very deeply. Earth stops being the default backdrop. It begins to appear as a miracle operating so quietly that people usually forget it is there. The atmosphere, gravity, the ecosystem, the presence of other human beings without being delayed by the speed of light. From the point of view of someone who has returned, those things are no longer background conditions. They are privileges. Every step in ordinary gravity, every conversation that does not require waiting tens of minutes for a reply, every breath of unprocessed air feels like an abundance, almost beyond measure. Perhaps that is why the question people love most, was it worth it, is also the hardest one to answer. Because the word worth quietly assumes that what was lost and what was gained can be placed on the same scale. But here, what was traded away were ordinary years of life, health, peace of mind, familiar relationships, and what was brought back in return: knowledge, achievement, perspective, a transformation in the understanding of existence itself. These things do not belong to the same system of measurement. They cannot be arranged neatly beside one another and added or subtracted. Perhaps the question itself is wrong from the beginning. There are experiences that lie beyond the language of cost and benefit. Climbing Everest, crossing Antarctica, descending to the bottom of the ocean. Efforts like these do not exist mainly because they are useful, but because they touch the outer edge of what human beings can do. A journey to Jupiter belongs to that same family of acts. It was not completed because it was convenient, nor because it was practical in any narrow sense. It was completed because, at a certain point in civilization, the question, can we do it at all, was itself powerful enough to pull humanity that far. And seen in that light, returning from Jupiter may be the hardest spaceflight achievement humanity has ever touched. Harder even than landing on the moon, if one considers the combined demands of distance, time, radiation, and isolation. Even future missions to Mars may not contain quite that same particular cruelty. Later journeys may become easier than the first, because the technology will improve and experience will deepen. But easier does not mean easy. Jupiter will never become routine. That is why the greatest legacy of the mission may not lie in each individual parameter that was measured, but in something far simpler, proving that human beings can go there and come back. Everything else will have to be built by others. Engineers will have to design the better spacecraft. Politicians will have to find the courage to fund something whose rewards may not arrive immediately. Future astronauts will have to accept stepping into a journey that those before them have only just made thinkable. For now, those who returned have only recovery left to them, slow and incomplete. The body heals in part. The mind continues to process what it has lived through according to its own rhythm, perhaps for the rest of a lifetime. Because the true cost of going that far does not lie only in medical damage. Part of that person remains out there, in the dark between worlds, around the orbit of Jupiter. A body can be brought back to Earth, but no one can return completely as the person they were before leaving. That is the hardest part. The numbers, of course, still tell their own story. 250,000 kilograms of propellant were consumed. 17 major system failures were survived. 8,000 hours of exercise were spent resisting the quiet disintegration of bone and muscle. 96 months away from home. For engineers and budget analysts, that is the language of the mission. Spreadsheets, graphs, ratios, reports. But those numbers do not hold the essence of what truly happened. Because what was brought to Jupiter was not only a spacecraft and a few human bodies, it was human consciousness itself, pushed to the edge of survival and then carried back. Every decision was made in isolation. Every repair was carried out in the clear understanding that failure here meant death. Every moment of doubt was pushed aside, simply because there was no option except to continue. The spacecraft brought the body home, but what it carried back was something even more fragile. Proof that minds formed under Earth's gravity, inside a 2-4-hour day-night rhythm, could still hold on to purpose at Jupiter's distance. That human beings could still choose to go on living, even when surrender seemed lighter. The rest is physics doing its work, indifferent to human dreams. Radiation continues to accumulate inside cells. Charged particles strike atoms, break bonds, and disorder DNA. Shielding can soften the blow, but it can never erase it. Every hour spent near Jupiter becomes part of a dose that will continue unfolding across the later decades of a life. Medical monitoring therefore continues, not as ritual, but as a reminder that some prices are not paid all at once. They are collected gradually, in installments, across everything that remains. Bone is the same way. Walking again under gravity does not make calcium automatically return to the places it once left. Bone density increases again to a certain point, and then stops. Enough for the body to live an ordinary life without shattering, but not enough to erase the trace of 10 years without load-bearing. On medical scans, the skeleton still keeps those porous regions, like sentences written into it by the journey. And yet, strangely, those marks matter less in the end than people once thought. They are indeed limitations. They do indeed require lifelong management, but they do not define the whole journey, any more than a scar can replace the entire story of a wound. What defines that journey, in the end, is not what it took away, but what it revealed about human endurance, when purpose becomes greater than comfort. And that is the part hardest to grasp. The psychological changes do not fully appear in questionnaires about sleep, anxiety, or mood. Those scales record symptoms. They do not reach the fundamental shift that happened inside a person who once watched Earth shrink to a dot, then spent years living in the absolute knowledge that no one could come to save them. There are changes that science can draw an outline around, but cannot truly touch at the center. And perhaps it is exactly there, in that blind space, that the deepest part of the journey continues to live. After Jupiter, the way a person measures danger no longer works as it once did. The things other people call stress, call risk, call a bad day, often pass by without provoking much real reaction. Not because the one who returned has become colder, but because the scale inside them was rewritten somewhere too far away. Once you have lived through 18-hour repairs to a life support system, knowing that failure means suffocation, it becomes very difficult to see traffic jams, storms, or scheduling problems as crises in anything like the same sense. The problem is that this distance cannot be bridged by explanation. Other people have never been there, and the person who has been there can never be someone who has not. So they still nod, still show sympathy, still do their part as someone living in society. But somewhere inside, the feeling of separation remains intact, a new kind of loneliness, not born of having no one nearby, but of having no one who truly shares your scale of things. Even among astronauts, that experience still occupies an extreme edge of its own. Those who have spent long missions in space may understand part of the isolation, the pressure of keeping systems alive, and the strange condition in which boredom and vigilance must coexist. But very few understand the specific conditions of Jupiter, the intensity of the radiation there, the slowness of communication, and the very concrete knowledge that you are farther from help than any human being has ever been. That is why, even within a community already so rare in its capacity for empathy, this journey still stands at another edge. Meanwhile, the scientific part of the mission has only just begun its real life. Terabytes of data gathered around Jupiter have gone into laboratories all over the world. Atmospheric researchers are reading the structure of winds in the clouds. Magnetosphere researchers are dissecting particle interactions inside the radiation belts. Scientists studying the surfaces of the moons continue tracing geological signals still dormant in the raw data. The crew helped open that door, but they themselves may not live close enough to the eventual results to see most of what comes from it. Science does not often reward its brightest moments fairly. It moves in small, slow, enduring steps. Perhaps that is true of this journey as well. It was not born to bring back one single answer, but to expand the boundary of what human beings can do. It is there that the meaning of the mission becomes very clear. It turned Jupiter from a beautiful problem on paper into a place that human beings can actually go to and return from. That difference may sound like a nuance, but in truth, it is an abyss. A mission that is survivable, and a mission that works only as a proposal belong to two different worlds. Engineers understand that very well, which is why they have already begun revising the drawings of the future based on the traces left by this mission. Radiation shielding built around the exact exposure profiles recorded by the dosimeters. Life support systems given extra layers of redundancy for the specific kinds of failures that actually occurred. Orbital and navigation plans rewritten around the difficulties the crew had to solve in real life. Those improvements do not make space gentle. They only make the danger less meaningless. Those who go after will still face new trials. But at least, they will not have to repeat exactly the same mistakes as those who came before them. What is strange is that the public debate seems to have changed less than people expected. Those who opposed the mission from the beginning still oppose it, arguing that the cost is too high and the risk too great, even after the mission proved that some portion of those risks can in fact be managed. Those who supported it from the beginning still support it, citing the very achievements and potential the journey has now made real. The safe return changes the calculations of those who truly look at the data, but it hardly shifts positions that were formed from pre-existing beliefs. That can be exhausting for those who came back, especially during public appearances when someone asks why money should be thrown into space while there are still so many problems on Earth. Because the question sounds reasonable, but is often built on a false assumption that space exploration and solving problems on Earth somehow compete for the same meaning. In reality, the technologies developed for a mission like this, new materials, recycling systems, medical monitoring, risk management, often flow back into fields that have nothing to do with Jupiter. The problem is simply that explaining this always takes longer than most people are willing to pay attention. So the final answer usually has to collapse into a shorter version, enough to make people nod, but rarely enough to truly change their minds. Children, strangely enough, understand more quickly. When someone walks into a school and talks about the journey, children do not begin with net benefit or balance sheets. They ask about the adventure, the discovery, the feeling of doing something hard. They almost naturally accept that there are things worth doing simply because they expand the edge of what is possible. Adults demand practical proof. Children accept the simple truth that sometimes we go because we can. Perhaps that difference is not really naivete. Perhaps it is another kind of clarity. After recovery, each member of the crew goes on into a different life. They stay in touch through messages, through video calls that still feel strangely immediate after so long a period. in which communication once carried delays so long that every reply felt like correspondence. The bond between them does not fade. It was forged in an environment where either everyone lived together or everyone died together. But a bond does not mean everyone goes on in the same way. Some choose to speak publicly and often about the mission. Some retreat into privacy. Some remain in the space sector. Some turn away from it entirely. The mission bound them together for a very particular stretch of existence, but it does not claim the whole future of each person, and the narrator remains, not on the spacecraft, but in conference rooms, on blueprints, in discussions about trajectories and shielding and margins of error that can kill. That work is useful. It turns a rare experience into something useful for others. But it also carries a low, persistent ache, because each contribution is also an admission that there will never be a return in the old way. The body no longer has that choice. The radiation exposure alone is enough to keep that person on the ground forever. From now on, they can only take part through knowledge, no longer through their own body. And strangely, that can hurt even more than the physical damage, because deep down, they know perfectly well. If they could, they would still accept another decade of isolation, another cycle of bone loss and muscle wasting, just for one more chance to see from Jupiter orbit those storms larger than Earth itself, turning in that hydrogen atmosphere. There were moments on the journey when I thought nothing on Earth could truly explain them. Small stretches of silence between the sounds of machinery, when every system was still running but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. That silence was not emptiness. It was so sharp it was almost transparent. And when a human being is reduced to just a few lives inside a thin metal shell suspended in infinite darkness, the mind becomes clear in a very different way. Perhaps that is why, if I still could, I would go back. But I cannot anymore. So the work that remains is to help others go in my place. In the end, the hardest part of returning from Jupiter does not lie in re-entry, heat, or in radiation, or only in the injuries the body must carry. The hardest part is realizing that there are places which, once you have gone there, you never return from intact. A part of you is left behind out there, around Jupiter, in the darkness between worlds. The body may come back to Earth, but some deeper parts cannot be brought home whole. And Earth, no matter how rich it is, has nothing that truly replaces what was left there. People still ask me whether I regret it, but that question always sounds as if I once had an ordinary choice. For people who take missions like that, going or not going does not feel like a choice in the usual sense. The mission had almost always been there already, hanging in front of me like something that had to be done. The only real question was whether I would be on that ship or not. Not going was what felt unimaginable. I do not wish things had been different. I only ever wished Jupiter were closer, the radiation weaker, the way home less merciless. But with the universe exactly as it is, I know I would still make the same decision. The true value of this journey may take many decades, perhaps centuries, to become clear. Perhaps it is only the opening move of a lasting human presence throughout the solar system. Perhaps it will become proof that some thresholds are simply too distant and should be left to robots. Or perhaps it will remain as a historical curiosity, an astonishing feat that did not truly redirect civilization. Those judgments do not belong to the people who went. They belong to history. My part was only to do it. The spacecraft that took me there and brought me back now sits in a museum. It is clean, carefully preserved, standing still behind barriers and plaques that tell the story of the mission in the language intended for visitors. People photograph the scorched marks on the heat shield, peer into the interior cabin, and are surprised by how cramped it is. Children bend down to take notes. Adults stand still for a few seconds, then move on. Every time I go back, it always seems smaller than memory, more fragile than memory. But that small machine did what it had to do. It brought me home. Standing in front of it, certain things return almost intact. The smell of recycled air, the faint vibration of systems in operation, the window frame that once showed Earth far away, then Jupiter enormous, then Earth far away again. Some experiences do not fade with time. They only change state, from memory into part of who you are. Once, while I was standing there, a child of about 10 walked up and asked whether I had really gone to Jupiter. I said yes. Then the child asked what it felt like. I thought of the short answers adults usually prefer. Very hard, very beautiful, very frightening. But none of them was enough. So I told the child something else, that it was the hardest thing I had ever done, and also the most important, and that if I had the chance again tomorrow, I would still go. The child stood still for a moment, as if placing each word exactly where it belonged, and then asked a new question, the truest one of all. Then can I go someday too? And in that moment I understood something that perhaps I only truly reached many years after coming home. Maybe this journey does not live only in the data, the systems, or the measurements. Maybe it also lives in the ability to stand here, in front of a child who has never seen Jupiter outside a textbook, and say, yes, you can go. It will be very hard. It may hurt you. It may change you forever. But you can go. Human beings have done it. And because of that, human beings can do it again. The child smiled, then ran back to the group. I watched and thought of the ship that will one day carry that generation, with better shielding, better engines, better lessons. All the things that exist partly because someone before them accepted stepping into territory no one had ever entered. They will face difficulties different from mine, but the fact that they are allowed to face those difficulties at all is already the direct consequence of something simpler. We proved that facing them is possible, and perhaps that is the deepest meaning of returning from Jupiter. It is not only orbital mechanics, nor only fuel, nor only radiation shielding. It is about going to a place so far away it almost seems not meant for human beings, surviving things that by all rights should hardly be survivable, and then coming back to tell those behind you that it can be done. The technical achievement matters enormously, but the proof matters even more. I left the museum in the late afternoon. The air outside still felt thick and rich to me, even after all these years. Earth's sky opened above me, and the stars began to appear as the light slowly faded. Jupiter was not visible that night. Wrong season, wrong hour, but I always know where it is. Always. Some part of me still silently keeps track of its position even when it lies below the horizon. Because in the end, the difficulty of returning from Jupiter cannot be fully contained in delta V tables, in columns of radiation doses, or in mission duration figures. Those things matter deeply for engineering, for design, for the people who will go next, but they do not hold the core of this. What is truly required is the willingness to accept that you will be changed forever. That part of you will remain behind. That returning does not mean coming back unchanged, but coming back in another form. It requires a readiness to pay prices that do not arrive all at once, but leak through the years and decades. It requires placing something greater than personal comfort and safety first. Most people will not accept that bargain. Perhaps they should not, but some will. They will go because now there is proof that it can be done. They will suffer in their own way, sacrifice in their own way, and then return in the way we once returned. Wounded but victorious, diminished yet also enlarged, physically home but spiritually still, turning somewhere in the darkness between worlds. If I had to truly answer the question, was it worth it? That is the closest answer I have. My body carries scars. My mind carries memory. My life continues along trajectories set by decisions once made in a spacecraft so far away it almost seems absurd. And no matter what, I would still do it again. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, not because it was pleasant, but because it was hard, and because it meant something. Human beings do not go to Jupiter and come back only when everything has become convenient, cheap, and nearly risk-free. Human beings do it when someone decides that the destination matters more than the difficulty. I decided, I went, I came back, and now Jupiter is still there, as magnificent as it is terrifying, still exactly as far away as it has always been. The only thing that has changed is that now we know human beings can cross that distance. Perhaps that is the most precious thing I brought back from Jupiter. Not samples, not data, not measurements, but proof. A simple, final, undeniable proof. It can be done.